She was born into marble halls and raised to be forgotten. Seris Valmere, the eldest daughter of a noble house, spent 23 years scrubbing floors beneath portraits of ancestors who never once looked down at her. Tonight, her mother sold her like surplus furniture to a lord she's never met. And tonight, for the first time in her life, she said no. The slap that followed? That wasn't punishment. That was her coronation. Stay until the end, because where this woman ends up will destroy you. Drop a like, and tell me, what city are you watching from? Let's find out where the brave ones live. The night Seris Valmere stopped being property began as most revolutions do, without ceremony. No thunder rattled the windows of Valmere Hall. No candle extinguished itself in dramatic protest. The chandelier above the main dining room continued its indifferent glittering, casting prismatic light across silver cutlery and the untouched soup growing cold in her bowl, and the three brothers who ate with the focused enthusiasm of men who had never once been told to be smaller. The fire in the east hearth popped and settled. The servants moved through their choreographed invisibility along the walls. Everything in that room performed its usual function. Everything except Seris. She sat at the far end of the table. Always the far end. Always just within the radius of family, without ever being truly inside it. And she watched her mother unfold a letter with the practiced elegance of a woman accustomed to wielding paper as a weapon. Lady Morwen Valmere read slowly. She always read slowly in public. It was a dominance display. The same way she poured wine with deliberate, unhurried movement and interrupted sentences at their most vulnerable midpoint. Slow was power when everyone else was waiting. Morwen set the letter beside her fork. She dabbed her mouth with linen. She looked down the table at her daughter the way a craftsman examines work that has disappointed them. Lord Rennick has agreed to the arrangement, Morwen said. You'll depart after the winter market. He requires a competent household keeper, and the Valmere name carries enough weight to satisfy his board. You'll manage his domestic staff. It's an honest position. She lifted her wine. It's more than you've managed to arrange for yourself. The dining room went quieter than it had already been, which was remarkable, because it had already been the particular silence of a house where one person controls the temperature of every conversation. Aldrich, the eldest brother at 21, did not look up from his venison. Peter examined his sleeve. Kyle, who was 17 and still young enough to occasionally make eye contact with Seris across the table during difficult moments, found something fascinating in his bread. Seris set down her spoon. The sound of it touching porcelain was somehow louder than anything that had come before. No, she said. It was not dramatic. It was not the voice of someone who had rehearsed rebellion. It came out quiet and a little hoarse, like a word that had been stored in a locked room for years and had finally found a crack in the door. But it was completely, unmistakably clear. Morwen's expression did not change. That was more frightening than anger would have been. Anger is a response. What her mother wore was something else. It was the face of a woman rearranging a problem she had already solved once and was displeased to revisit. I beg your pardon? I said no. Seris met her mother's eyes across the length of the table, 23 years of distance and marble between them. I won't go to Lord Rennick's household. I won't be transferred to another man's property and called it generosity. You will lower your voice. I'm not raising it, Seris. Her mother's tone shifted into something Seris recognized from childhood, from the particular frequency that used to make her stomach drop and her spine curve automatically toward apology. It was the voice that said, "You are embarrassing me, and that is the only real crime here. You are being childish. Lord Rennick's household is a respected—" He's 54 years old and his last keeper left after 8 months. Seris pushed her chair back an inch. I know why she left. Maren told me. She told me exactly why she left. Morwen set her wine glass down with precision. Maren is a servant. Maren was Lord Rennick's keeper for 8 months, and she came back to this city with bruises on her wrists and wouldn't look men in the eye for 3 weeks after. Seris heard her own voice level out into something she hadn't quite inhabited before. Not anger, certainty. You know what Lord Rennick is? You've always known. And you arranged this anyway. Petter coughed. Aldrich finally looked up, though his expression was the specific blankness of a man who has decided that what happens next is not his concern. Kael had gone pale. Morwen rose from her chair. She walked the length of the table the way she crossed every room. without hurry, without doubt. And she stopped beside Seris and looked down at her with those pale gray eyes that had never once held warmth that was not strategic. "You have lived in this house for 23 years, Morwen said, very quietly, "and in that time you have contributed precisely what I have directed you to contribute. You keep the accounts when Aldrich loses patience with numbers. You manage the seasonal inventory because no one else will do it with sufficient care. You are useful, Seris. I am offering you the opportunity to continue being useful in a position that does not require you to be remarkable. Because, and here the pause was surgically placed, you are not remarkable. Bam Pakshwam. The room breathed. Seris stood up. She was not tall. She never had been. But she stood up from that chair slowly, unfolding to her full, unremarkable height with her faded linen dress and her ink-stained fingers and the dark circles under her eyes from 3 nights of poor sleep. And something in the act of simply standing upright in that room felt like the first honest thing she'd done in years. "Then find someone else to transfer," she said. The slap came without warning, though in retrospect she would understand it had been inevitable from the first word she'd spoken tonight. It was not theatrical. It was not the expression of a woman who had lost control. That was what made it so precise. Her mother had not lost control at all. The slap was an administrative action, a correction applied to a system that had malfunctioned. The sound it made echoed off the marble floor and the high ceiling and the portrait of great-great-grandfather Valmere, who had written extensively about honor in his private journals and had beaten 2 of his servants badly enough that one of them never walked properly afterward. Seris's cheek burned. Her eyes watered from pure reflex. She did not raise her hand to touch the mark. She looked at her mother. Morwen had already returned to her chair. She was smoothing her sleeve. "You will leave in 3 weeks," Morwen said. "You may use the time productively." Seris stood in the middle of the dining room for a moment that lasted somewhere between 3 seconds and the rest of her life. She looked at Aldrich, who had gone back to his venison, at Peter, who was studying the candelabra, at Kael, who looked at her with something anguished in his young face, and then looked away because he was 17 and the cost of looking was more than he had yet figured out how to pay. She looked at the portrait on the wall, at the chandelier, at the silver cutlery and the cold soup and the fire that continued burning with perfect indifference. Then she walked out of the dining room. She did not pack properly. Later, she would think about this, how she went up to her small room at the back of the east wing, the one with the window that faced the stable yard rather than the gardens, and she stood in the middle of it for 4 minutes doing nothing at all. Then she put on her heaviest wool dress over the one she was already wearing. She took her shawl, the dark gray one with the fraying edge that she'd repaired twice already, and planned to repair a 3rd time. She took the small leather case with her sewing tools because she had carried it since she was 15, and it felt wrong to leave it. She took 7 coins from the jar in her wardrobe and left the rest. She did not take anything that had been given to her by her mother. She went down the back stairs, through the kitchen corridor where Bessa, the night cook, looked up from her bread dough with wide eyes, and opened her mouth and then closed it again without saying anything, which was the most anyone in that house would offer her tonight. Out through the yard door, across the stable yard where her breath made small white clouds in the winter air. She did not look back at Valmere Hall. She told herself she would not look back. At the gate she looked back once, fast, the way you look at something you're trying not to memorize. Towers. Lit windows. The silhouette of the chandelier through the dining room glass still glittering, her brothers in there eating, her mother in there composing herself. The house standing as it had always stood, enormous and organized and perfectly indifferent to the girl walking away from it. She turned north and kept walking. The cold found her within the first hour. She had spent 23 years in that house and she had been cold within it, cold in ways that have nothing to do with temperature. But this was a different thing entirely. This was the cold of the actual world, of winter air that did not care whether you were a noble's daughter or a ditch digger's, that moved through your wool dress with simple democratic brutality. Her fingers numbed inside her shawl. Her breath came in white bursts. The cobblestones of the city gave way to packed earth road and then to rougher ground as the lights of Valmere's city fell behind her. She walked for 3 hours before she let herself feel any of it. That is not metaphor. That is the literal account of what happened. She walked, and she did not think about the slap or her mother's face or Kael's expression or the chandelier or what came next. She thought about the ground in front of her feet and whether the stones were slippery and the rhythm of her own movement through the dark. Her mind had made a kind of emergency decision. Not yet, not yet, not yet. And she honored it by simply moving forward. But bodies have their own accounting systems. Around the third hour, when the road had become a track through frozen meadow grass, and the first black tree line of the northern forest was visible against the stars, her legs simply stopped working correctly, and she sat down on a fallen log at the roadside and put her face in her hands and did something she hadn't done in years. She cried ugly, not the composed weeping she'd permitted herself occasionally in her room, restrained and quiet in the way she'd learned to be quiet about everything in that house. This was the other kind, the kind that involves sounds you wouldn't choose to make, the kind that comes from somewhere below conscious production, guttural and graceless and honest. She cried the way a person cries when they have been holding something for so long that the sudden absence of what they were holding against creates a collapse. She cried for the 7-year-old who had first learned that her mother's love was a ledger rather than a fact. For the girl who had kept the household accounts with such careful precision because she believed that usefulness could be converted, eventually, into belonging. For every morning she'd woken before the brothers to begin the work that would never once be acknowledged as work. For Marin, who had come back from Lord Rennick's with bruised wrists and cast-down eyes, and whom Seris had been too afraid to help, because helping would have required visibility, and visibility was dangerous in a house that ran on selective blindness. She cried until she ran out of material. Then she sat with her hands in her lap on the frozen log at the edge of the northern forest and looked at the stars for a while. A sound reached her from somewhere in the tree line. Distance made it uncertain. It could have been wind, could have been an animal. She sat still and listened. It didn't repeat. Here is what she did not think. I am free. Because that was a thought for later, for someone who had slept and eaten and found solid ground beneath her feet. What she thought instead, with a clarity that surprised her, was, I would rather die in that forest than go back. That thought, ugly as it was also clean. It had no conditions attached to it. It was not a statement of despair, it was a statement of geometry, the shape of her available world, honest at last. She stood up, she pulled her shawl tighter. She walked into the forest. The northern forest at night in winter is not the forest of pleasant seasonal imaginings. It is black pine that closes over your head until the sky becomes a memory, and roots that reach for your ankles in the dark, and silence so comprehensive it has weight. Things move in it that you can't see clearly. The rustle of something larger than a rabbit in the undergrowth, the distant call of something that might be a bird or might not be. The temperature drops another 10 degrees once you lose the open sky's ambient light. Seris moved through it for another hour, following the track that eventually thinned to something barely distinguishable from animal passage, before she smelled smoke. Not a campfire. Something more complex, the smell of burning that had already mostly happened, residual and acrid. She followed it without making a conscious decision to follow it, moving toward the light that eventually resolved through the tree trunks. A clearing, about 40 yards ahead, where several torches were still burning low. She heard voices before she could see the clearing properly. She stopped behind a broad pine and looked. What she saw sorted itself slowly into comprehensible pieces, the way a complex image in poor light takes time to read. 8 men, heavily armed, arranged in a loose circle in the clearing. Crossbows, short swords, chains. The professional equipment of bounty hunters. She had seen them twice before in the city market, recognizable by the iron badge pendants they wore and the way they moved as groups rather than individuals, a particular predatory patience in their stillness. At the center of the circle was a man. She almost didn't register him as singular at first because his scale was wrong for her reference points. He stood, and standing seemed too modest a word for what he was doing, which was more accurately described as occupying space in a manner that made the space itself seem to have been designed around him. He was very tall. His shoulders had the geometry of someone who had not merely trained his body, but had used it continuously for years in ways that left structural evidence. Dark hair, unbound, somewhat matted from what had clearly been recent violence. There was blood on his forearm. There was blood on 2 of the bounty hunters as well, which was informative regarding recent events. His clothing was not what she expected. Not armor exactly, though he wore worked leather over a dark shirt. What he wore had the quality of a ruler's garment without being decorative, functional, but in the way that the best things are functional, with a precision that communicated resources and taste applied to utility rather than display. There was a torn section at the left shoulder, the chains they had around his wrists, and she could see now that there were chains, heavy iron ones, were taut because he had his arms partially extended, holding two of the bounty hunters at the ends of the chains with the controlled stillness of a man who could jerk those chains in any direction at any moment and was choosing not to. "Lord Kaelor," one of the bounty hunters was saying, the one standing slightly ahead of the others who had the bearing of the group's decision-maker, "you've caused considerably more trouble than your bounty justifies, if I'm being forthright with you. The Halvern Consortium wants you alive, and we intend to oblige them. The alive part gets negotiable if you continue in this direction." The man at the center of the circle, Lord Kaelor, was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a quality she hadn't anticipated from his appearance. She had expected something loud, commensurate with his scale. What she heard instead was measured and deep, with the particular unhurried register of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be heard. "Auric Dunmore," he said to the leader, "I know your family. Your father ran horses in the Saltfen Valley before he lost the farm to the Halvern Consortium's land purchase. That would make you—" He paused almost imperceptibly, "a very interesting choice of employment." A silence in the clearing. "Don't," Dunmore said, and his voice had tightened. "I'm not judging the path. The path makes sense, economically." Lord Kaelor shifted his weight, almost casually, and the two men at the end of his chains took an involuntary step to compensate. "I'm observing that you've given your service to the people who took your father's land, and wondering whether that's the kind of thing a man thinks about at night, or whether he's made his peace with it." "Bind his mouth," someone said from the circle. "Let him talk," Dunmore said, which was interesting. He was staring at Lord Kaelor with an expression Seris couldn't entirely decode from her position behind the pine. "Let him finish." "I'm finished," Kaelor said simply. "Just wanted to know whether you knew." Then several things happened in a sequence so rapid that Seris could only reconstruct it afterward, in the way you reconstruct something you saw in poor light. Kaelor moved his arms, not the explosive, desperate movement of someone breaking free, but the intentional, controlled movement of someone executing a plan. And the chains whipped outward, and the two men at their ends were yanked off their feet, and Kaelor was already moving before they hit the ground. And the clearing erupted into the specific chaos of people who had prepared for resistance but not for resistance at this speed. She should have run. She understood that clearly, in the same part of her brain that computes basic survival requirements. She was unarmed, exhausted, cold, and alone in a forest in the dark. And what was happening in that clearing was not her business in any configuration. She did not run. She crouched behind the pine and she watched. He moved through 8 armed men with a terrible efficiency that she found herself studying the way she had once studied household ledgers, tracking the pattern, the internal logic, the system. He was not simply stronger and faster than them, though he was obviously both. He was reading the geometry of the situation continuously, the positions of bodies and weapons, and adjusting, and there was something almost mathematical about it that was more frightening than mere violence would have been. 3 of the 8 were unconscious or incapacitated before the others had fully oriented to what was happening. A 4th caught him with a crossbow bolt, a grazing shot to the side. She could see the tear in his shirt, and he registered it with something that looked less like pain than annoyance, and he turned toward the shooter with a focus that made the man take 2 steps backward before Kaelor reached him. Within 2 minutes, she counted, absurdly, because counting was something she did when she was managing her own terror. 5 men were down and 2 had run. Dunmore was the last one standing, backing toward the tree line with his sword raised, breathing hard. "You're going to have to kill me," Dunmore said, "because if you don't, I'll come back with 30 men. Peace out." "I know," Kaelor said. He wasn't breathing particularly hard. He stood in the middle of the destroyed circle of torches and fallen men with his chains hanging from his wrists. Someone had managed to cut the crosspiece between them, but the cuffs remained. And he looked at Dunmore with an expression she couldn't read. "That's the problem with your kind of loyalty. It survives the evidence." Dunmore lunged. The fight that followed was brief. After it was over, Dunmore was alive, which surprised her, sitting against a tree with his arms bound behind him with his own rope. his sword gone, conscious but not going anywhere for some time. Kaelor retrieved a fallen torch from the clearing floor. He was looking at the wound in his side, pulling the torn shirt fabric away from it, assessing. Not performing calm, actually calm, which was a different thing. He pressed his palm against it with the matter-of-fact attention of a man who has done this before enough times that the emotional content of bleeding has been mostly processed out. Then he looked directly at the pine tree she was hiding behind. "You've been there since before Dunmore threw the crossbow," he said, not loudly, the same measured tone he'd used in the middle of the fight. The wind shifted twice. "Whatever you're trying to decide, decide it." She could have run now. He wasn't looking at the tree with any particular intensity. He'd returned his attention to his wound. He was giving her the option. She stepped out from behind the pine. In the torchlight, she saw his face properly for the first time. Not beautiful in any conventional sense. Too much of it had been broken and rebuilt. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, old enough to have faded silver. His eyes were a color that the poor light made difficult to categorize, but that read as dark amber, or perhaps a deep gold, the color of something that had been through fire. He looked at her with the same level attention he'd applied to everything else in the clearing. He did not look surprised. He also did not look like he was going to kill her, which she was aware was a limited metric for trust, but was what she had available. "You're running," he said. It wasn't a question. "Walking," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "North," he said. "North." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Dunmore against the tree, then back at her. "You should keep moving," he said. "This clearing will be less safe by morning. Dunmore is right that he'll send more men. Whether they come for me or whether they decide to be thorough about clearing witnesses." He left that sentence structurally complete. "Where are you headed?" she asked. The question seemed to genuinely interest him, in the way that unexpected things interest people who have stopped expecting them. "North," he said. She looked at him, at the wound he was pressing his palm against, at the iron cuffs still locked on his wrists, at the 7 men he'd put down in under 2 minutes without a single weapon. She looked at the forest around them, at the dark between the trees, at the direction she had been walking before the smell of smoke redirected her. "Then we're going the same way," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know you," he said. "You don't know anything about me," she agreed. "And I know almost nothing about you except that you're bleeding and those cuffs need a key, and I watched you give a man who'd been hired against you the option to walk away before you fought him, which is an interesting choice." She paused. "Seris Valmere, formerly of House Valmere, as of tonight." "Formerly," he repeated, the word careful in his mouth, like he was checking it for hidden weight. "Formerly," she confirmed. Another silence. He studied her with those amber gold eyes, and she had the unsettling sensation of being read very accurately, of being processed the way he'd processed the geometry of the fight. Not with hostility, but with thoroughness. It was uncomfortable in a way that was different from the discomfort of her mother's assessments. Her mother had looked at her and seen a ledger entry. This man was looking at her and seeing something she couldn't yet identify. "Draven Kaelor," he said finally. Not a title, not a performance, just a name offered in exchange for a name. "The cuffs need a key or a hammer. There's a settlement I know, 2 hours northeast." "2 hours," she said. "At your pace, probably 2.5. She processed this. "Let's call it 2 hours and see who's right." He bent and retrieved his coat from where it had been thrown during the fight. He shrugged it on. He picked up the one torch that was still burning with reasonable stability and extended it, not toward her as an offering, but simply holding it at a position between them that made it equally accessible. She took the other side. They walked north. For the first 30 minutes, the silence between them was the functional silence of 2 people moving through difficult terrain in poor light, with a shared practical interest in not twisting ankles or losing the track. She concentrated on the ground. He walked slightly ahead, she noticed, but not in the way of someone claiming precedence, more the way of someone who understood that his vision in the dark was apparently considerably better than hers, which she would have found more surprising if she had known yet what she was walking beside. The wound was slowing him down. Not obviously. He was too controlled for obvious. But she could see the compensation in his gait, The way he minimized rotation of his torso, the extra second he took before stepping on uneven ground. She didn't comment on it. He broke the silence first, which also surprised her. House Valmere, he said. Not a question, but an opening. Northern borderland nobility. Minor house, old name, some influence in trade administration, 3 sons, 1 daughter. She paused. Me. And the daughter left. The daughter was sold. She said it without particular emotion. The word had been sitting in her chest all night, and it came out now like a stone settling. To a man named Rennick, as a household keeper, dressed up as an opportunity. She heard herself and added, "My mother doesn't think she was selling anyone. She thinks she was managing a resource she'd grown tired of maintaining." Kaelor was quiet for a while. "How long have you known it was going to end this way?" he asked. The question caught her sideways, not because it was aggressive, but because it was precise. He'd found the actual sore spot without needing to circle it. 7 years, she said. Maybe more. I kept telling myself it was going to change, that if I was useful enough, careful enough, took up less space. She stopped, started again. That's the lie, isn't it? That there's a version of yourself that's exactly the right size to fit inside someone else's cruelty without it hurting. Kaelor stopped walking. She stopped too, and looked at him and found him studying a point somewhere in the middle distance between them and the tree line. "A lord I knew," he said slowly, "old man, ruled a barren mountain province for 40 years, once told me that the worst prisons are the ones with open gates, because at least in a locked cell you know what you are. In a house with an open gate, you spend your whole term trying to convince yourself you're choosing to stay." He paused. "I was 11 when he told me that. I didn't know what he meant for a long time." She looked at him. "What happened to him?" she asked. "He died in that province," Kaelor said. "Never left. Kept finding reasons the gate wasn't as open as it looked." He started walking again. She walked beside him. The track climbed after the next bend, which neither of them had seen coming, and the climb was steep enough that conversation became impractical for a while. The torch threw amber light across ice-edged rocks and the skeletal reach of winter bare undergrowth. Something large moved in the darkness to their left, far enough away to be uncertain. Kaelor's head turned toward it and then dismissed it in a single economy of attention. They crested the ridge and stopped. Below them, the northern wilderness opened up in a way that the forest had been hiding. Mountains. Not the familiar tame hills of the borderland she'd grown up knowing through windows. The actual mountains, black and white under a sky brilliant with stars, their peaks jagged as broken things against the dark. The scale of it pushed something out of her chest that she didn't have a name for. "How far north are you going?" she asked, very quietly, because the view seemed to require a lower voice. He stood beside her looking at the mountains. "As far north as necessary," he said. She looked at his profile in the torchlight, at the silver scar, at the iron cuffs, at the way he looked at those mountains, not with longing, exactly, but with something that might have been recognition, like a man looking at the place he was supposed to be. "That's an interesting answer," she said. "The honest one," he said. She looked back at the mountains. She had 7 coins, a sewing kit, 2 wool dresses, and a shawl with a fraying edge. She had left a household that had required her exhaustion and returned nothing. She had never in 23 years made a decision purely from want. Every choice had been calculated within the narrow margins of someone else's expectations and her own survival within them. She looked at the mountains. She thought, a person could go a very long way and still not reach those peaks. She thought, good. 2 hours, she said, and began walking down the other side of the ridge. Behind her, she heard him follow. They found the settlement in just under 2 hours, which she did not comment on, but noted privately with a satisfaction that was also new. The satisfaction of being right about her own pace, about her own capability, as if her legs and their rhythm were information she could trust. The settlement was 6 buildings around a stone-walled yard, functionally a way station rather than a proper village. A stable, a smithy, 2 storage houses, a tavern of sorts, and a place that rented sleeping space. Fires burned inside. The sound of men talking reached them while they were still 40 yards out. Kaelor stopped before they entered the firelight. 2 things, he said. She waited. The men in that tavern are not dangerous to you specifically. They're traders, A couple of caravan guards. A pair of fur trappers who'll be there every night until spring. They will not trouble a woman walking through." He paused. "They will, however, recognize me, which changes the environment." She looked at him. "What's the second thing?" "The blacksmith will open his forge for the right coin or the right persuasion," he said. "I have some coin remaining." He looked at the iron cuffs on his wrists. "But a woman walking in alone with a straight request will receive considerably less scrutiny than I would." She understood immediately. "You want me to go in and ask the blacksmith to remove bounty hunter restraints?" "I want you to go in and ask the blacksmith to remove iron cuffs," he said. "The framing is negotiable." She looked at the settlement, at the light in the windows, at the sounds of men who did not know she existed, who would see a young woman in wool and a shawl with a fraying edge and make a dozen small assumptions, most of which she could use. "Give me the coin," she said. He produced it from somewhere inside his coat and placed it in her hand without ceremony. Their fingers did not quite touch. She closed her hand around the coins, 3 of them, heavier than her own, and turned toward the settlement. She was almost at the gate when his voice reached her, not loud, just carrying in the cold, still air. "Valmere!" She turned. In the darkness at the edge of the firelight, with the iron cuffs on his wrists and the wound in his side and those amber eyes, he looked like something she didn't have proper language for. Not threatening. Threatening was too simple. Something older than that. "If the blacksmith makes trouble," he said, "walk out. Don't negotiate it. Just walk out." She looked at him for a moment. "I've been negotiating trouble my entire life," she said. "I know what it costs." She turned back to the settlement and walked in. The smithy was behind the main building. The blacksmith was a broad-shouldered woman of about 50 who did not appear particularly interested in why a young woman was standing in her shop at this hour asking to have iron cuffs cut. Not wearing them herself, she explained, but needing them removed from a traveling companion who had found himself in an unfortunate situation with some aggressive debt collectors. The blacksmith looked at her for a long moment. "How aggressive?" she said. "They were the kind who used chains," Seris said, "and they ended up worse than he did, so I think we can agree the debt situation is resolved." The blacksmith's expression didn't change, but something moved in her eyes. "3 coin," she said. 2.5. And I won't mention that your back storage room smells considerably more like certain contraband herbs than a legitimate smithy typically would," Seris said pleasantly. The blacksmith looked at her for another moment. 2.5, she said. "Bring him in." The iron cuffs came off in the forge's firelight with 2 clean cuts and a sound like small judgments being concluded. The blacksmith worked without comment. Kaelor sat on the low bench provided and watched the woman work with an attention that was respectful rather than impatient. The attention of someone who recognized skilled labor. The marks the cuffs had left on his wrists were angry-looking. The skin beneath chafed and abraded. When the blacksmith handed him a cloth dipped in something that smelled medicinal, he took it with a courtesy that Seris found herself cataloging without meaning to. The specific way he handled the exchange, the absence of any presumption in his bearing, the thank you that was not performed but actual. She was revising her assessment of him, she realized, in real time. And the revision was complicated because her reference points for men in possession of significant power were limited to her father and brothers and Lord Rennick by reputation. And none of those references had prepared her for this particular configuration. Outside, while he checked his side wound in the light from the smithy window, worse than a graze, she could see that now. Though he was treating it with the same pragmatic attention he'd applied to everything else, she told him about the storage room. He looked at her. "Did it actually smell like contraband herbs?" he asked. "I have no idea what contraband herbs smell like," she said. But she didn't know that. A silence. "You lied," he said. Not accusatory, more the tone of someone updating information. "I negotiated," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. Lying is when you want the other person to believe something false. Negotiating is when you want them to consider whether verifying the alternative is worth the cost." She paused. She decided it wasn't. He looked at her for another long moment with those amber eyes. "The Halvern Consortium has 3 representatives in this region," he said. It seemed like a change of subject. It wasn't. "They've been after Nightfang Dominion's southern trade routes for 2 years. What Dunmore's men were doing tonight was not a bounty operation. It was a message, proof of concept that I can be taken. He looked back at his wrists, flexing his fingers against the residual stiffness. I need to be north of the Cairn Pass within 4 days, or the message lands without response, and it will cost my people a great deal more than 1 night in chains. She listened to this. Nightfang Dominion, she said. You've heard of it. Rumors, borderland stories. She paused. They say the Northern King rules wolves. He looked at her. Literally, she said. That's the story, that the Northern King is... I know what the story says. Something in his tone was not confirmation and was not denial and was something else entirely, something that dropped a stone into the still water of her certainty about what was real. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those amber eyes in the firelight and said nothing else. And a very particular kind of cold moved through her then, not the cold of the winter air, but the cold of standing at the edge of something much larger than the world she had mapped. How far is Cairn Pass? She asked, because that was the question that had an answer. 3 days north. He said it steadily, watching her face. If the weather holds. She looked at the mountains in the distance, at the darkness between the trees, at this man who had told 8 armed men his name like it was an argument and had moved through violence like a man reading familiar text, and had asked her a question about what she'd known and when she'd known it with the precision of someone genuinely interested in the answer. She was 23 years old. She had 7 coins minus what she'd given the blacksmith. She was standing at the edge of the northern wilderness in winter with a man she'd met 2 hours ago in a clearing full of unconscious bounty hunters, and the wind had just shifted and brought with it something she couldn't identify. Not wood smoke, not animal, something else. Something that moved against the back of her skull like a warning in a language she didn't speak yet. She was about to say something, she wasn't sure what, when the sound reached them. Horns. Not one. Several. Arranged in the specific pattern she had heard once before 2 years ago, when the Halvern Consortium's security forces had done a collection sweep through the borderland markets. They were not far. East of them, moving north-northwest. Fast. Kaelor had already turned toward the sound, his entire bearing shifting in a way she could only describe as becoming more what he actually was. The careful, legible expressions stripped back, something beneath them that was older and more dangerous and completely awake. That's not Dunmore's 30 men, she said. No, he said. His voice had dropped to something sub-vocal. Dunmore wasn't the message. Dunmore was the test. He turned and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that was not fear. It was much more controlled than fear, but was related to it, the kind of alertness that comes from knowing exactly how bad the situation is. They have lichen hunters with them, not soldiers, specialists. She processed this. People who hunt what you are. The sentence sat between them. He said nothing. The horn sounded again, closer. And Draven Kaelor, who had fought 8 men without apparent effort and discussed his own captivity with the equanimity of a man reviewing history, looked at Seris Valmere, formerly of House Valmere, woman of 7 coins and a fraying shawl and 23 years of compressed rebellion. And she saw in his face the first fully unguarded thing she'd seen from him all night. He did not want to run without her. The understanding of that arrived in her chest with a weight she wasn't prepared for. Then we don't have time for this conversation, she said. No, he said. North? North. She started moving. And in the trees behind the settlement, not 20 yards from where they'd been standing, something enormous shifted in the darkness. Something with amber eyes that caught and held the distant torchlight. And it made no sound at all. It simply began to run. And when she finally looked back at what was keeping pace beside her through the black trees, Seris Valmere understood, all at once and completely, that she had left one world tonight. She had not yet reckoned with what world she had walked into. She ran. That is the simple fact of it, stripped of everything else. Seris Valmere ran through a black pine forest in the middle of a winter night, with the sound of hunting horns narrowing behind her, and something enormous keeping pace through the trees to her left, that she was not yet ready to look at directly. Her lungs burned, her ankles found every root and frozen ridge in the ground. The shawl caught on something once, and she yanked it free without stopping. heard the fabric tear and kept moving because the fraying edge had already been a problem, and problems you already know are manageable. The thing in the trees did not make a sound. That was the part her mind kept snagging on, even as she ran, even as her breath came in white bursts, and her thighs screamed at the grade of the slope she was climbing. The absolute silence of something that massive moving through undergrowth at that speed. She had grown up near the borderland hunting estates. She knew what large animals sounded like at speed through forest. This was not that. This was something else. She crested a ridge and stopped because the ground dropped away sharply on the other side into a narrow ravine, and stopping was survival, not hesitation. She stood on the edge, breathing hard, and looked to her left. The wolf sat at the tree line 10 feet away. Not sat, exactly. It had stopped moving when she stopped, and it was in a stillness so complete it could have been carved from the forest itself, except for the amber eyes, which were watching her with an attention that was nothing like animal attention. Animal attention is scattered, referential, reading 40 inputs simultaneously. This was singular. This was the same quality of attention she had encountered 2 hours ago in the clearing when a man had looked at her from the center of a circle of bounty hunters and assessed her without hostility. It was very large in a way that recalibrated her sense of scale in real time. The shoulder height was above her waist, the body mass suggesting something between a draft horse and whatever lived in the oldest northern stories. The fur was the color of deep water at midnight. There was a tear in the fur at the left side, below the ribs, that corresponded precisely to where the crossbow bolt had caught Draven Kaelor's shirt. She looked at the wound. She looked at the eyes. "Okay," she said. She said it the way she'd said no to her mother earlier that night. Not dramatically, not as performance, but because it was the accurate response to what was in front of her, and accuracy had always been her most reliable tool. The wolf looked at her. The horn sounded again, southeast, closer. She turned and looked at the ravine. Steep, but not unclimbable on the other side. There was a shelf of rock partway down, then a frozen stream bed, then the opposite slope. She had done harder things in worse light. "I'm going down," she said to the amber eyes. "If there's a better route, and you know it, now would be the moment." The wolf moved, not toward the ravine, but northeast along the ridgeline, angling, and she followed the direction of its movement and saw what it had seen. A fold in the ridge where the descent was managed, rocky and steep, but with enough purchase for careful feet. She followed it. Here is what she understood about herself. Descending into that ravine in the dark with a massive wolf picking its way down the slope ahead of her. She was not brave in the way stories meant when they used that word. She was not fearless. Her hands were shaking, had been shaking since the horns first sounded, and there was a cold sweat working its way down her spine that had nothing to do with temperature. What she was instead was someone who had learned very young that fear is information rather than instruction. Her mother had used her fear as a handle, had gripped it, and steered her for 23 years with the precision of a driver who knows exactly where the wheels will go. The only way that stopped working was if fear stopped being a handle. She was afraid of the wolf. She was afraid of the hunters behind them. She was afraid of the drop below her right foot and the ice on the rock surface and the darkness that began 10 feet beyond where the ambient starlight reached. She moved anyway. At the bottom of the ravine, the frozen stream bed gave them a clear track north, and they took it, moving fast. The wolf slightly ahead, and Seris reading its behavior for information, the way she'd learned to read every environment she'd ever been in for what it was actually saying rather than what it presented. It slowed when the ice grew uncertain. It stopped twice, ears rotating, before moving again. She matched its rhythm and didn't ask questions. The horns fell behind them. After 20 minutes, they hadn't heard them for long enough that she let herself slow from the run to a fast walk, and her body registered this change with the specific gratitude of muscles that have been operating past their comfortable range. Her right knee, which had never been entirely reliable since a fall from a ladder 2 winters ago, sent her a sharp reminder of its opinion. The wolf slowed to match her pace. She looked at it sideways. It looked ahead. "I need to know," she said between breaths, "whether this is permanent." The wolf did not look at her. "Because if you are permanently a wolf," she continued, "then our arrangement becomes complicated in ways we should probably discuss." She paused. "Not that we have an arrangement. We have a direction." The wolf stopped. She stopped. They were standing in a moonlit section of the ravine where the cliff walls fell back and the sky opened up, and the moonlight fell on the wolf with a quality she would have described as particular, the way moonlight sometimes falls on water in a way that seems directed. The change happened. She had braced herself, in some theoretical way, for something violent, for the visual grammar of transformation as she knew it from Borderlands stories. The cracking and tearing, the screaming suggested by every account she'd ever heard secondhand. What actually happened was both more and less than that. It was not painless. She could see from the tension in the lines of him that it was not painless. But it was more like watching something become the shape it had been all along than like watching something break and reform. Draven Kaelor stood in the streambed with the moonlight on him, breathing in controlled, steady pulls, his hands loose at his sides, wearing what remained of his clothes, which had fared poorly but had not entirely failed. He looked at her with those amber eyes. She looked back. "Not permanent," he said. His voice was slightly rougher than it had been. He cleared his throat. "Good," she said, a silence that had several layers to it. "You're not running," he observed. "I considered it. I'm not most people." She said it without heat, just as a correction of category. "I grew up in a house that ran on a very specific kind of fear, the fear of disappointing someone who controlled your survival. Everything was structured around that fear. What I look like when I'm afraid, how I respond, what I do with it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not afraid right now, but I'm also not going to let it make my decisions." He studied her for a moment with an expression she was starting to learn, the one he wore when something had surprised him and he was deciding what to do with the information. "The hunters back there," she said. "Lichen hunters, you called them. What do they actually know?" "Enough." He began moving again, north, and she fell into step beside him. "The Halvern Consortium has been funding research into Lycan tracking for 3 years. They have someone in their employ, a former Dominion border scout, went freelance after I expelled his clan for treaty violations, who knows our travel corridors, knows how we move in this form." He paused. "The horns aren't for communication. They're for disorientation. High frequency in certain patterns affects Lycan hearing at close range, makes it hard to hold the shift." She processed this. "So the strategy is to destabilize your most significant advantage before engaging." "Yes." "That's actually a good strategy," she said. He glanced at her. "I'm not complimenting them," she said. "I'm thinking about counter strategy. If the horns are the primary tool, then the counter isn't faster running. It's distance. Stay ahead of the horn range." She worked through it. "What's the range?" "Effective range is roughly a quarter mile. We're currently outside it." "Then we need to stay outside it." She thought about the terrain. "Do they know where you're going?" "They know the Cairn Pass is the northern corridor. They'll have people ahead as well." "So they're funneling," she said. "Yes." She walked and thought, and the frozen stream bed took them north through the ravine. This is the thing about power that most people misunderstand, and Seris had been working toward this understanding all her life without having the frame for it. Power is not the absence of vulnerability. Every powerful thing she had ever encountered had a specific vulnerability, and the ones who lasted were not the ones who had eliminated their vulnerabilities, but the ones who understood them clearly and planned around them. Her mother's vulnerability was that her system required compliance, and compliance required the people in the system to remain afraid. Remove the fear, and the whole architecture collapsed. Draven's vulnerability was the horns, the hunters who had studied him, the specific frequency that destabilized what he was. The Halvern Consortium's vulnerability was what it always was for any organization that ran on acquisition. They had told too many people too much in order to build their coalition, which meant information moved in too many directions. She turned this over in her mind as they walked. "The border scout," she said. "The one they hired. He went freelance when you expelled his clan. What was the treaty violation?" Something shifted in Draven's expression, the internal weather of a memory he'd made some peace with. "His clan was operating a trafficking route through Dominion territory, using our mountain passes to move people." His voice stayed even, but went flat in a particular way. "Children, mostly, bound for the southern labor markets." She absorbed this. "You expelled them," she said. "Not executed." "I expelled them." He said it with a careful absence of inflection that communicated considerably more than inflection would have. The law of the Dominion on treaty violation is expulsion. The law is the law because it is applied uniformly. If it bends for my anger, it bends for everyone else's convenience, and then it isn't law anymore. He paused. But I knew when I made that decision that the scout would end up in someone's employ eventually. The ones with his kind of knowledge always do. Another pause. I made the right call, and it cost me. She looked at his profile. You could have bent the law, she said. No one would have challenged you. No, he agreed. No one would have challenged me, and I would have known. And the next time the law became inconvenient for someone with power, the precedent would have been set. He looked forward. A king who only holds himself to standards when it's easy isn't holding himself to standards. He's performing them. The ravens of Seris's 23 years of careful observation arranged themselves into a new pattern. She had grown up around power. Her father had it, locally, in the way that minor nobility has it, bounded and petty and exercised primarily downward because it was too small to exercise in any other direction. Her mother had the subtler kind, the kind that runs a household and shapes the people within it through 1,000 small, unlegislated decisions. Neither of them had ever once, to her knowledge, made a choice that cost them something in service of a principle they actually held. Her father bent every rule that inconvenienced him. Her mother's principles were purely aesthetic. She believed in order and appearance and the correct presentation of the family's standing, and any principle that served those values she upheld with absolute ferocity, and any principle that didn't, she ignored. The man walking beside her had expelled a clan he had the power to execute because the law required expulsion, and had then lived with the consequences of that decision for years, including tonight. She didn't know yet what to do with that information. It sat in her chest alongside the wolf and the amber eyes and the question he'd asked her in the forest, "How long have you known?" with the weight of things that require time to become fully understood. They emerged from the ravine into open highland as the sky began to lighten imperceptibly in the east. Not dawn, too early for dawn, but the first theoretical shift from deepest night toward the idea of morning. The mountains were a presence in the north, enormous and closer than they'd seemed from the ridge. Below them, the terrain opened into a frozen highland bowl with scattered copses of black pine, and at the far edge, the lights of what appeared to be a larger settlement. Draven stopped and looked at the lights. "Grave Eel," he said. "There are Dominion contacts there. We can rest, resupply, get word north." He looked at his side where the wound from the crossbow had soaked through the fabric he'd pressed against it. "And I need to deal with this before it becomes a problem." "It's already a problem," she said, "because it was." He looked at her. "The crossbow bolt caught the edge of something it shouldn't have," she said steadily. "I can see it from here. You've been compensating in your gait for 3 hours. The cold has been managing it, but—" She looked at the lightening sky. "Once you warm up, that's going to make itself known considerably more." He didn't ask how she knew. What he said instead was, "There's a healer in Grave Eel." "Good," she said. "Then let's move before you stop being stoic enough to walk." He looked at her with something that was almost amusement, and then his face resettled into its usual controlled register. They walked toward the lights. Grave Eel was not a comfortable town. It had the particular energy of a place that existed at the edge of multiple jurisdictions and had learned to be useful to all of them without committing to any. The architecture was functional to the point of severity. The streets were clean in the way of places where mess gets resolved quickly and without ceremony. And the people they passed at this early hour moved with the eyes-forward purposefulness of those who have found that curiosity is a liability. It was not unfriendly, it was careful. The Dominion contact was a man named Sable, who ran a trading house on the northern edge of the settlement, and who opened the door at their knock with the specific absence of surprise that indicated he had been warned of something, if not exactly this. He was maybe 60, lean, with the remnants of considerable physical capability in his build, and the eyes of someone who had spent decades in proximity to dangerous things. He looked at Draven, at the wound, at Seris, in that order. "Twice in one season," he said to Draven. "There was a complication." "There's always a complication with you." Sable stepped back from the door. "Get in, both of you." He looked at Seris again, a brief assessment that was professional rather than personal. "You're not Dominion." "No," she said. Borderland. Formerly. He processed this with the economy of a man who has learned that formerly is often the most significant word in a sentence, and stepped back. The trading house was warm in the way she had forgotten warmth could feel after hours in winter night air. It moved against her cold skin like something almost painful, and she stood just inside the doorway for a moment while her body negotiated the temperature change. The smell was wood smoke and dried herbs and old leather and the particular dust of stored goods. Shelving along every wall, a central hearth burning well. 2 lanterns on the work table turned low. Sable went immediately to a locked cabinet and began pulling supplies, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who has dressed wounds before and recently. Draven sat in the chair indicated without argument, which told her something about how much the wound was actually costing him. Your northern routes are compromised, he told Sable while the older man worked. The consortium has a former Dominion scout in their employ. Eric's clan. Sable's hands didn't stop moving, but his jaw tightened. Eric Vane. You know him. Knew him. His father and I ran the Eastern Pass routes together 20 years ago. Something moved across Sable's face. He turned out bad early. What's his fee? Enough that I can't outbid it tonight. Draven looked at the wound as Sable cleaned it, direct and unsentimental. I need word sent to the Dominion forward post that the Cairn approach is being watched, and I need alternate route information. The Cairn approach has been watched for 2 weeks, Sable said, and his voice had changed slightly. That's what I've been trying to get word to you about. A silence. The message I sent to your last position 3 days ago, Sable continued, not looking up from his work, was that the consortium has a coalition, not bounty hunters, not scouts. They've brought in the Marin trading lords and 3 of the borderland provincial governors. He glanced up briefly. They're claiming Nightfang has been raiding southern supply lines, which is a lie, but a well-constructed one. They've got testimony. Draven was very still. They're building toward a formal grievance, he said. Building toward a formal grievance with teeth. Sable tied off the bandaging with a firm pull. They want territorial concession, the southern mountain passes in exchange for dropping the claim. He sat back. Which you'll never give them. Which I'll never give them. So they're building toward war, Sable said flatly. And they've spent 2 years making sure the surrounding powers will either stay neutral or quietly support them. That's what tonight was about. Not capturing you, demonstrating that you can be caught. The room held the weight of this. Seris, who had been standing near the hearth, warming her hands and listening, turned this information over with the same mental facility she'd applied to household accounts and borderland politics she'd absorbed through years of managing correspondence her mother didn't know she read. The testimony, she said. Both men looked at her. You said they have testimony that Nightfang has been raiding supply lines, she said to Sable. What's the source? Sable studied her for a moment. He looked at Draven. She's fine, Draven said, with an economy that was itself a kind of statement. Sable looked back at Seris. 3 independent merchants, certified before a borderland magistrate. They claim Lycan raiders hit their caravans in the Saltfin Valley over the summer. The Saltfin Valley, Seris said. Yes. She looked at the hearth for a moment. The Halvern Consortium completed its land purchase in the Saltfin Valley in the spring, the one that took Dunmore's father's farm. She said this quietly, working it through. They bought most of the productive valley land and then converted the farming operations to a leasing model that raised rates by 60% over 2 years. The merchants who were doing business in that valley before the purchase, she looked at Sable. How many of them are still operating independently? A silence. Most of them moved operations, Sable said slowly. Moved operations or were bought out? Sable looked at her with an expression she was familiar with, the expression of a person recalibrating. Bought out, he said. Mostly. So the 3 independent merchants providing testimony about Lycan raids in the Saltfen Valley are, in all likelihood, men who either work for the consortium now or have significant financial relationships with them. She looked at Draven. The testimony isn't just false, it's constructed. And if it was constructed, there's a record of construction, payments, instructions, the original land survey documents that would show the timing of the purchases and the subsequent changes to Valley commerce. Balber Street, says. She paused. That kind of record doesn't disappear. It gets misfiled. It gets buried in administrative correspondence. But someone signed those documents. Draven was looking at her with the complete focused attention of a man who has just heard something he needed. You can find it, he said. It was not quite a question. I can tell you where to look, she said. I spent 6 years managing my family's administrative correspondence, and 3 years before that watching my mother manage it. The borderland provincial governors who are supposedly supporting this coalition, they run their provinces through the same administrative structures as every other borderland household. The same structures I know. She met his eyes. Documents like that go through a magistrate's office, through a provincial records clerk, through at minimum 2 sets of hands before they become certified testimony. People who handle documents leave traces. Sable made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Who are you? He asked. Formerly House Valmere, she said. Currently undecided. Sable looked at Draven. Draven looked at Seris. And here is where the story turns on something that has no drama in its execution, but is the actual hinge. Everything else swings on. The decision a man makes about whether another person's competence is a threat or a resource. Power that insists on being the only intelligence in the room will always eventually fail, because the room is bigger than one intelligence can manage. Draven Kaelor had ruled Nightfang Dominion for 9 years through a combination of force and strategic clarity, but force had limits. Force could hold the borders. Force could answer a direct challenge. Force could not read a provincial magistrate's filing system. He understood this, not as a concession, as a fact. What do you need? He asked her. She blinked. It was the only visible reaction she permitted herself. In 23 years, no one in a position of authority over her had asked her that question. What do you need? With the actual expectation of a practical answer. Access to the Borderland Provincial Administrative Network, she said, once she'd assembled the answer. Physical, ideally. I need to be somewhere that documents flow through. She paused. And I need to not be obviously who I am, because if House Valmere has put out any kind of notice about their missing daughter, that's a complication. Nightfang has a legitimate trade presence in 2 borderland towns, Draven said. Legal operation, above scrutiny. The senior factor in Keldmere has administrative access through her trade license. How much does she owe you? Enough. Seris nodded. Then Keldmere. She looked at the wound he was pressing carefully with his bandaged side. After you've slept. After we've both slept, Sable said, firmly, with the tone of a man who has managed difficult people for decades and intends to continue doing so. There are 2 rooms upstairs. Both of you will use them. The consortium's people move in daylight, and we are not going to undo a night's work by stumbling around exhausted. He looked at Draven. This is not a suggestion. Draven looked at Sable for a moment. You've been telling me what to do for 9 years, he said. And you've been occasionally listening for 9 years, Sable said. Tonight you're going to do it without the occasionally. She had expected to lie awake. She had expected the events of the night to sit on her chest and conduct a thorough inventory of every decision she'd made since walking out of her mother's dining room. She was wrong. She was asleep within 4 minutes of lying down on the narrow bed in the upstairs room, still in her 2 wool dresses, shawl folded under her head because the pillow was thin. She slept for 6 hours. When she came downstairs, Draven was already at the table with Sable and a third person she hadn't seen before. A young woman, maybe 20, dark-haired and watchful, who turned out to be Sable's factor assistant and who had arrived in the early morning with information from the Dominion's network that changed the immediate geometry of the situation. The Cairn Pass is being watched from both approaches, Draven told her, sliding a rough map across the table. I know, Seris said, studying it. There's a third route, the Harrow Gap. He indicated a point on the map that was significantly east of the main pass. It's longer, 2 more days. Rough terrain. She looked at the map, at the relative positions of the consortium's reported positions, at the watershed lines that indicated the terrain type, at the settlement of Keldmere, which was positioned interestingly close to the eastern approach to the Harrow Gap. Keldmere is on the way, she said. Yes. She looked up at him. Something had changed in the light of day. Not in him exactly, but in her ability to read him. The night's emergency had stripped context from everything, including her own perception, and now in the gray morning light over a rough map in a safe house in Greyveal, she could see the full shape of what she was dealing with more clearly. He was tired. She could see that now, the wound and the night and the shift all pulling at the reserves a person maintains for public bearing. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there in the torchlight. His hands on the table had the slight deliberate stillness of hands that are being kept still. And he was watching her with that amber-eyed focus, and she understood, with the same clarity she'd had in the ravine, that he was not certain she would continue, that he was waiting to see if she would. "I'll need appropriate clothing for someone operating in a trade context," she said to Sable. "Not noble, not servant, factor class, which means something decent but not decorated. And I need a name." Sable raised his eyebrows. "A name? I'm not traveling to Seris Valmere, Sombar. If my mother has sent notice, the name will flag. And if we're heading into borderland administrative territory, I need credentials that hold a basic check." She looked at him steadily. "I assume you have resources for that kind of thing?" Sable looked at Draven. "I told you," Draven said. "You told me she was sharp," Sable said. "You didn't tell me she was—" He searched for the word. "Practical," Seris supplied. "Practical," he agreed, and she thought there was something appreciative in his voice. He stood. "I have credentials. I'll have clothing sorted within an hour." He looked at them both. "Eat something first, both of you. That's an order, and I don't care who's a king." She ate. Draven ate. They sat across the table and ate bread and hard cheese and drank something hot that was not quite tea, but served the same function, and did not speak much. And the silence between them had changed from the night silence, less functional emergency, more the silence of two people who have passed through something together and are still taking stock of the other side. "Your family will send notice," he said, eventually. "Probably," she said. "My mother will frame it as concern. Missing daughter, worried household. She'll believe some of that." "And the other part?" "The other part is that I walked out of a transaction she'd arranged, and that reflects on her administrative competence." She looked at her hands around the cup. "She'll want me back more than she'll want to admit that she does." "What happens when we can't avoid that anymore?" She looked up at him. "When it becomes unavoidable," she said, "I'll be the one who handles it." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said, with a precision that was not harsh but was final. "That's the point. I'm not handling it because I owe anyone a confrontation. I'm handling it because it's mine to handle, and I've spent 23 years letting other people handle things that were mine." She paused. "Including myself." The silence that followed was not empty. Sable returned with the bundle of clothing and a folded document and a name. Mira Ashvin, Factor's assistant, credentials issued through a legitimate northern trading concern that would hold a secondary check but not a thorough one, which was as much as they needed. She changed in the upstairs room and looked at herself for a moment in the small mirror above the washstand. Dark gray wool. Good quality. The kind of clothing that communicated competence without inviting scrutiny. She had tucked her hair up differently. She did not look like the forgotten daughter of House Valmere. She looked like someone who had somewhere to be. When she came downstairs, Draven was standing at the door talking to Sable in low tones, and he stopped when she entered and looked at her with that careful amber attention. She watched him take in the clothing, the posture, the changed presentation, and she watched him not comment on it. "Ready," she said. "There's something else," Sable said, and his voice had changed. He looked at Draven with an expression that communicated the specific weight of information being delivered to someone who is not going to want it. "The Consortium's coalition. The Borderland governors." He paused. "One of them is Cassian Valmere." The name landed in the room. Seris heard it and went very still. Her father. Lord Cassian Valmere, who had sat at the head of the table and said nothing. Who had always said nothing, had made an entire identity out of the strategic absence of an opinion that might cost him something. Who had apparently, in the time since she'd walked out of his house, signed his name to a political coalition against the man who was standing across this room from her. She looked at Draven. He was watching her. "Did you know?" she asked very quietly. "No," he said. And then, because honesty was apparently structural to him rather than optional, "But I should have anticipated it. The Halvern Consortium has been recruiting borderland houses for 2 years. The Valmeres control a key northern trade road. They're a logical addition. She processed this. Her father, who had watched her mother run the household into the shape of a prison for 23 years, who had eaten his dinner while his eldest daughter was slapped across the face at his own table and gone back to his venison, who was now, apparently, a signatory to a coalition that was building toward war against the man she was about to walk into the northern wilderness with. That, she said slowly, complicates several things. Yes, Draven said, including the part where I was going to use my knowledge of borderland administrative structures to find the false testimony documents. She looked at Sable. If my father is in the coalition, he may have been involved in constructing the testimony. That possibility exists, Sable said carefully, which means the documents I need to find might be in Valmere administrative records. She heard herself say this with a flat evenness that she was distantly aware required effort, which means at some point I may need to go back. You don't have to, Draven started. I know, she said, the same precision as before. I know. She looked at the door. Outside, the morning was gray and cold, and the mountains were somewhere to the north under cloud, and somewhere behind them the Halvern Consortium's hunters were regrouping, and somewhere further behind that, in the marble halls of Valmere Estate, her father was writing letters that were helping to build a war. She picked up her pack. Let's go, she said. They went. And 3 hours north of Greyveal, on the highland track toward Keldmere, when the low winter sun finally broke through the cloud cover and threw pale gold light across the frozen moorland, Seris Valmere understood something with the specific finality of a door closing. She was not going to be able to end this simply by walking away. The world she'd left was going to come north and find her. The only question was whether, when it arrived, she would be the same woman who had walked out of her mother's dining room with 7 coins and a fraying shawl, or something else entirely. She looked north at the mountains. She thought, I need to be something else entirely. She walked faster. Keldmere arrived on the second afternoon as a smear of gray smoke against a white sky, and then resolved, as they descended from the highland track, into something more substantial. A working town, neither prosperous nor desperate, with the particular functional density of a place that exists because trade requires it to exist, rather than because anyone chose it with affection. The streets were cobbled unevenly, patched in sections with packed gravel where the original stone had heaved from frost. The buildings were stone and timber, 2 and 3 stories, sharing walls in the compressed pragmatism of northern construction. Signs above doorways advertised services rather than establishments: weighmaster, factors registry, bond house, grain assessment, the civic vocabulary of a town organized around the movement of goods rather than the comfort of people. Seris walked into it as Mira Ashfin, factor's assistant, and the name fit better than she expected. She had worn so many versions of herself over 23 years: the dutiful daughter, the invisible administrator, the careful reader of rooms, that inhabiting a new frame was less like lying and more like selecting the most applicable tool from a kit she'd spent her whole life assembling, without knowing that's what she was doing. Draven walked beside her as something less identifiable, which was itself a kind of performance. He had the coat's collar up and the specific bearing of a northern trader: present, capable, not interesting. It was almost convincing. The amber eyes were the problem. Nothing he wore or didn't wear entirely solved the amber eyes. The Dominion factor was a woman named Lyra Thenk, operating out of a trade house on the eastern side of the market square, and she opened the door to Sable's letter with a face that went carefully neutral in the specific way of a person receiving information they were hoping not to receive. She was maybe 45, compact, with the hands of someone who had counted and stacked and sorted physical goods for decades. She looked at the letter. She looked at Draven. She looked at Seris. She looked back at the letter. You want access to the provincial records office, she said. Through your trade license, Seris confirmed. A licensed factors representative has standing to review administrative filings related to trade route certification and merchant registry. I need to review the summer filings from the Salt Fen Valley district. Lyra set the letter on her desk and looked at it for a moment. The provincial records office in Keldmere processes documents for 4 borderland houses, she said, including Valmere. I know, Seris said. And you're asking me to put my license? I'm asking you to grant a representative access, Seris said, keeping her voice level. You won't be in the records office. I will. Your license provides the standing. What I find or don't find is my business, not yours. Lyra looked at Draven. Sable's letter says I owe the Dominion a significant favor, she said. It does, Draven said. Is this the favor? That depends on how you count. A silence in the trade house office that smelled of dried ink and old wood. Tomorrow morning, Lyra said finally, the records office opens at 7th bell. I'll have the credential papers ready. She looked at Seris with something direct in her expression. You know what you're looking for? I know exactly what I'm looking for, Seris said. That night they stayed in the rooms above Lyra's trade house, which were spare but warm and compared to the previous 2 nights, constituted a substantial improvement in basic conditions. Seris sat at the small table by the window for an hour after the house went quiet, working through what she knew and what she needed to find, mapping the administrative structures she understood onto the probable shape of what the consortium had done. The logic of constructed testimony is not complicated once you understand the underlying systems. Documents don't appear from nothing. A merchant's certified testimony before a provincial magistrate requires a filing date, a notary's mark, a cross-reference to the merchant's registry number, and at minimum 1 supporting document establishing the merchant's standing in the relevant trade district. If the merchants were consortium affiliated, and she was increasingly certain they were, the registry numbers would trace back to filings made within the last 2 years, after the land purchases. The Saltfen Valley filings would show a gap. Independent merchants before the purchase, affiliated merchants after, and somewhere in the transition period, the paperwork that connected the two. She was looking for a thread. Pull it right, and the whole constructed story came apart. She fell asleep with her notes in her lap. In the morning, she went to the records office alone. This was the arrangement. Draven had looked at her when she said it, and she had looked back at him, and the conversation that wasn't a conversation had concluded with him nodding once, which she understood to mean that he was not pleased, and also that he recognized she was right. A man with amber eyes and a king's bearing walking into a provincial records office would generate the kind of attention that destroyed the purpose of going there. She was Mira Ashvin. She was unremarkable and competent, and she had a licensed credential and a specific request, and a face that her mother had spent 23 years ensuring people looked past. She used all of that. The records office was staffed by 2 clerks, both young, both slightly bored at 7th bell, and the senior of them processed her credential without particular interest and directed her to the Saltfen district filing boxes with the manner of a man who has shown people to filing boxes many times and expects to do so many more. She worked for 3 hours. Here is the truth about administrative records. They are the most honest documents that exist in any system, because no one lies to a filing box. People lie in correspondence. They lie in testimony. They lie in every form of communication that has an audience. But a filing system is not an audience. A filing system is just a receptacle for what actually happened, time-stamped and cross-referenced by clerks who don't care about the content, only the classification. The Saltfen Valley District summer filings told a story. She found it in the merchant registry cross-references, the way she'd expected. 3 names: Dovan Harch, Callum Steen, Peter Malv. Each had filed testimony regarding Lycan raiders in the valley during the summer months. Each had their registry numbers listed on the testimony documents. Each registry number traced back through the cross-reference system to the commercial license filings. And the commercial license filing showed, with the impassive clarity of administrative record, that all 3 men had transferred their independent merchant licenses to affiliated status with the Halvern Consortium Land and Trade Division within 18 months of the Valley land purchase. Harch's transfer was dated 2 months before his testimony. Staten's was dated the same month. Malv's was dated 3 weeks before. She sat with these documents for a long moment. There was more. There was always more once you found the first thread. The testimony cross-referenced a provincial magistrate's certification, a man named Aldous Farron, operating out of the Valmere provincial seat, and the certification date was 4 weeks before she had walked out of her mother's dining room, which meant it had been filed while she was still in that house, managing the household correspondence. Sitting at the far end of the table at dinners she was not quite part of. Her father's provincial seal was on the certification document, Lord Cassian Valmere, who had said nothing, who had always said nothing. She copied every relevant document in a careful hand, using the blank paper she had brought in her case along with her sewing tools, writing small and precise the way she'd learned to write when she was managing accounts. And paper was a resource to be economized. She worked without hurry. She did not let herself feel anything about her father's seal until she was outside the records office, on the cobbled street, with the gray winter sky above her and the copied documents inside her case. Then she stood very still for a moment. Her father had not simply failed to act. He had signed his name to the machinery of a manufactured war. He had certified testimony he knew or should have known was false, in service of a coalition that was building toward violence against the Dominion that was. She looked north, toward where the mountains were still hidden behind cloud, toward where she was going. It was not surprise that moved through her standing there on the Keldmere street. She had known, in the abstract, that her father was the kind of man who committed to whoever held the room's momentum. She had watched him do it her entire life. She had simply never before been on the receiving end of it as an enemy rather than a dependent. She walked back to Lyra's trade house. Draven was in the main room when she entered, sitting at the table with a cup of something, and the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting and has been managing the waiting. He looked at her face and read it with the speed that was becoming familiar to her. "You found it," he said. "I found it." She set her case on the table and opened it and laid the copied documents out with careful precision. 3 merchants, all consortium affiliated. The transfers are dated within 2 months of their testimony. The provincial certification is signed. She placed her finger on the relevant document. By Lord Cassian Valmere. A silence. Draven looked at the document, then at her. "Your father," he said, not as clarification but as acknowledgement of weight. "My father," she confirmed. He looked at the documents and she watched him process the political geometry of what she'd found. Watched the thing behind his eyes that was always calculating, always reading the landscape of consequence, work through what this meant for the Dominion's position. It took perhaps 10 seconds. "This is enough to challenge the testimony's validity before the Borderland Council," he said. "Not enough to dissolve the coalition. The consortium didn't build this on testimony alone, but it removes the legal foundation they were using to justify the provincial governor's involvement." He looked up at her. "It forces them to move faster than they planned, or pull back and regroup. Neither option is comfortable for them," she said. "No." She looked at her father's seal on the certification document. "I need to take this to someone with standing to present it," she said. "I don't have standing. I'm a runaway noble daughter with a borrowed name." She paused. "But Lyra does, through the factor's license. She can file a challenge to the testimony certification through the commercial registry. It's within the license's scope. A licensed factor challenging the validity of documents affecting trade route access." Draven looked at her for a moment. "Lyra will say no," he said. "I know," Seris said. "I need you to talk to her." What she did not say, because she had not yet assembled it into a thing she could say, that she was aware, watching him across the table, in the gray morning light of Lyra Thank's trade house, that she was asking him to use his influence on her behalf in a way that created a debt she did not yet know how to repay. That the simplicity of their North is North arrangement was already behind them. That something had changed in the ravine, in the stream bed, in Sable's kitchen, and she had not stopped to examine it because there had not been time, and she was not certain what she would find if she did. What she said instead was, "She owes the Dominion a significant favor, and she's practical. Give her the full picture and let her weigh it." He stood. "All right," he said. The conversation with Lyra happened in the back office and lasted 40 minutes, and Seris waited in the main room and listened to the rhythm of voices through the wall without being able to make out words. At some point, Lyra's voice went sharp, and then went quiet, and then Draven's voice was the only one she could hear, low and steady. And then Lyra's voice came back, and it had changed, had shifted into something more considered. When they came out, Lyra looked at Seris with an expression that was somewhere between appreciation and exhaustion. "You pulled the Saltfen filings," she said. "Yes." "And you found the registry transfers?" "Yes." Lyra looked at the documents on the table. She pulled the certification document toward herself and studied it for a long time. She turned it over and looked at the notary's secondary mark on the back. which Seris had also copied, and which bore a registration number she recognized because she had spent 3 years managing correspondence that went through the same notary. "This notary works for my father's household," Seris said quietly. "He's been the Valmere provincial notary for 11 years. Lyra set the document down. "If I file this challenge," she said, "the consortium will know someone is working against them in Keldmere within a week." "Yes," Seris said, "and my trade license becomes a target." "Yes." Lyra looked at Draven. "And you're telling me the Dominion will provide commercial protection to my operation's northern routes as compensation?" "Guaranteed passage and preferential rate agreements," Draven said. "In writing, sealed, before you file." Lyra sat down. She looked at the documents for another long moment. She was doing the math that every pragmatic person does when abstract principle and concrete risk collide in the same ledger. Not whether the right thing was right, but whether the right thing was survivable. "File it as a commercial registry challenge to flawed certification," Seris said, "not as a political challenge to the testimony itself. The distinction matters. A commercial challenge is about process irregularities and can be filed by any licensed factor with standing in the affected trade district. It doesn't name the consortium directly. It doesn't name my father directly. It simply notes that the certification documentation contains cross-reference inconsistencies that require administrative review." She met Lyra's eyes. "You're not accusing anyone of anything. You're flagging a process problem." Lyra looked at her. "You know how these things work," she said. "I grew up inside how these things work," Seris said. Another moment. "Write the challenge," Lyra said. "I'll review it before I sign anything." Seris wrote it at the table in the main room while Draven sat across from her and Lyra moved through her trade house doing the ordinary work of the day with the specific, determined normalcy of a person who has made a difficult decision and is managing her own reaction to it by refusing to be still. The writing took 2 hours. She wrote carefully, with the precision she had developed over years of managing documents that had consequences, threading the language through the narrow passage between sufficient specificity to be actionable and sufficient vagueness to be deniable. It was, she would think later, some of the best work she had ever done. Lyra read it twice, made 2 corrections, and signed it. She filed it through Keldmere's commercial registry office that afternoon. The first crack appeared the following morning. She woke before dawn to the sound of movement on the street below the trade house and lay still for a moment listening, and the quality of the movement was wrong, purposeful in the specific way that people moving in the dark before legitimate business hours are purposeful when they are doing something that requires the cover of before dawn. She was at the window in time to see them, 6 men, positioned around the trade house at the angles that indicated they were not passing through. 2 at the main entrance, 1 at each side street. 2 more she couldn't see but could infer from the pattern. They wore no identifying marks, but they carried the organized patience of professionals. She crossed the hall and knocked twice on Draven's door, the pattern they had agreed. He was awake. She could tell from how quickly the door opened. She said, 6. Street positions, before dawn. She watched his face make the calculation. His eyes went to the window at the end of the hall, and he crossed to it and looked out for approximately 3 seconds and came back. "They're not here to move yet," he said quietly. "Positioning. They're waiting for something." "For light," she said. "Or for more people." "Or for the signal that we've seen them," he said, with the specific flatness of someone identifying a trap's mechanism. "If we run, we confirm we're here and who we are." She looked at him. "So we don't run." "So we don't run." She went back to her room and dressed, moving with the same controlled efficiency she had applied to every crisis in the 23 years of her life. The emergency accounts review when the winter supplier failed to deliver, the 2 times the household staff had discovered discrepancies in the inventory, and she'd had to resolve them before her mother found out. The night 3 years ago when her youngest brother Kael had been found by the city watch, and she'd handled the entire situation before dawn without anyone in the household knowing. The competence of someone trained by necessity. They were at Lyra's kitchen table with tea when Lyra came downstairs and saw their faces and went very still. "How many?" she asked. 6 visible, Draven said. Lyra sat down. She wrapped her hands around a cup and looked at the table, and she was frightened. Seris could see that clearly. Frightened in the way that practical people are frightened, not dramatically, but thoroughly, with a complete understanding of the specific shape of the threat and what it meant for the specific shape of their life. "How did they find you this fast?" Lyra asked. "The challenge filing," Seris said. "The commercial registry clerk." She paused. "Someone in that office is reporting to the consortium." Lyra closed her eyes briefly. "Of course they are," she said. "This is the nature of institutional corruption, which is not always dramatic and is almost never singular. It does not announce itself. It accumulates through small accommodations. The clerk who accepts a supplemental payment for expedited processing, who begins to understand that certain filings generate inquiries from people he would rather not receive, who one day crosses a line that feels smaller than it is because every line before it has been smaller than it was. Corruption is a gradient, not a cliff. By the time you're at the bottom, the top is too far above you to see clearly. The clerk in the Keldmere Commercial Registry Office had been somewhere on that gradient for an unknown period of time. He had seen Lyra Thank's filing. He had contacted someone, and that contact had moved fast. "There's a back route," Lyra said quietly, "through the tanner's yard on the east side. It connects to the river path, and the river path goes north." She looked at Draven. "The tanner owes me a favor, not a large one." "How large does it need to be?" Draven asked. "Smaller than this," she said honestly. "But he'll do it anyway. He's a decent man." She stood up. "Give me 20 minutes." She went out the back of the trade house alone, and in the silence she left behind Seris and Draven sat across the kitchen table from each other and did not speak for a while. And the quality of that silence was different from any of the silences that had come before it. "They got to the filing within hours," Seris said finally. "Yes. Which means the consortium's network in this region is better than Sable knew." She said it steadily, but she was working through what it meant. "Which means either Sable's information is out of date, or—" She stopped. Draven was looking at her. "Or what?" he said. She looked at him. The thing she did not want to say sat in her chest with a density that was almost physical. "The route here," she said. "The Harrow Gap alternative. The positioning of Greyvile on the Safe House network. Sable knew all of it." She heard herself. Sable was the only one who knew all of it. A silence that had a different quality now. The silence of something shifting. "Sable has been a Dominion contact for 9 years, Draven said. His voice was very controlled. "I know," she said. "He's been reliable. I know." She did not look away from him. "And the consortium's network move on Lyra's filing happened within hours of us arriving in Keldmere via a route only Sable knew." She paused. "I'm not saying I know. I'm saying the geometry fits." Draven was very still. There is a particular kind of pain that belongs exclusively to betrayal from inside the circle of trust, and it has a texture that is different from any other pain because it requires retroactive revision. Every memory that involves the betrayer must be re-examined. Every shared moment, every piece of information given and received, every gesture of loyalty, all of it must be turned over and looked at from the new angle and asked the question, was this also the mechanism? Was this also the instrument? The wound is not just in the present. It reaches backward through time and recuts everything it touches. Draven knew this. He had known other versions of it, but knowing the shape of a thing does not make it lighter when it lands. He stood up from the table and moved to the window and looked out at the lightning sky with his back to the room and his hands loose at his sides, and she watched him manage it, watched the particular discipline of a man who has trained himself to be a certain way under pressure, because being a different way has cost him things he cannot afford to lose. He stood like that for perhaps a minute. "If it's Sable," he said very quietly, "then the route information for the Cairn Pass and the Harrow Gap is also compromised." "Yes," she said, "and the Dominion forward post contact is compromised. Potentially. And every safe house in the southern network that Sable has coordinates for." She let him work through it. It was not cruelty to let him work through it. It was respect for the completeness of his comprehension. He needed to know the full shape before he could begin to address it. He turned from the window. "I need to get north without using any route Sable provided," he said. "Yes. Which means I need route information from a source that is not connected to his network." His amber eyes found hers. "Your knowledge of borderland administrative structure, the trade route certifications in the Saltfen filings." He said it carefully. There would be certified Northern Mountain Passage routes in those documents. Commercial routes, not Dominion routes. Routes that Sable's network would not have. She had already thought of this. She had thought of it at the table before he turned from the window, because she had been ahead of the geometry since the moment she said the geography fits and seen his face receive it. "I need to go back to the records office," she said. "They have people on the street," Draven said. "I need to go back to the records office alone," she said, before the men on the street decide it's time to stop waiting. He looked at her. "If they see you, then I become Mira Ashvin, and I am a licensed factors representative who left something behind yesterday." She held his eyes. "The credential is still valid. Lyra hasn't revoked it. I walk in, I retrieve the commercial route filings I need, I walk out. And if they know who you are," she paused. "Then it gets complicated," she said. "But we're already in complicated." The silence between them was not about the plan. The plan was what it was, and both of them knew it. The silence was about the other thing, the thing that had been building since a clearing in a forest and a frozen stream bed and a kitchen table in Greyville, where he had asked her, "What do you need?" and she had felt the genuine shock of a person being asked that question with actual expectation of a practical answer. "You could go north from here without me," she said. It came out more level than she felt. "The river route Lyra mentioned goes north. You know this terrain better than I do. You could move faster alone." He looked at her for a long moment. "I could," he said. "But you won't," she said. She said it not as accusation and not as plea, but as simple recognition, the same register she'd used when she said, "Okay" to the wolf in the ravine. "No," he said. "I won't." She nodded once. She picked up her case. 20 minutes, she said. She walked out the back of the trade house into the pre-dawn gray of Keldmere, through the alley, circling around to approach the records office from the north side, away from the men she'd seen positioned on the street. She moved at a pace that was purposeful rather than urgent, the walk of a person with a morning errand rather than a person who had spent a night working against a consortium and was currently attempting to extract critical intelligence without being identified. The records office opened at 7th bell, and she was there at 7th bell, second through the door, behind a grain merchant with a certification renewal. The same senior clerk from the previous morning processed her entry without particular interest. She found the northern commercial route filings in the adjacent cabinet to where she'd worked yesterday. She worked faster this time, with the specific efficiency of a person who knows exactly what they're looking for and where the filing system keeps it. The Northern Mountain Passage routes were certified through the Commercial Trade Authority rather than the Provincial Military Authority, which meant they had different documentation requirements, more specific, more recent, with current seasonal assessments. She copied 6 routes. She noted the certification dates, the passage conditions, the registered commercial carriers who used each. 3 of them were viable for winter transit. One of them, the easternmost, was so obscure that it had only 2 registered commercial users in the past 4 years, both of them small northern fur operations, and its certification had been renewed automatically rather than through any active use assessment. That was the one. She was replacing the filing box when the door of the records office opened. She did not look up immediately. She finished replacing the box with the deliberate care of a person completing a task, closed the cabinet drawer, turned with the natural unhurried movement of someone who has finished what they came to do. The man who had entered was not a bounty hunter. He was not a soldier. He was a man she recognized from a distance of 11 years' household memory. Aldous Farron, provincial notary, whose seal she had seen on the certification document. He was maybe 50, thin, with the hands of someone who worked with documents and the eyes of someone who had spent years in the specific proximity of powerful people that teaches you to read the room before entering it. He looked at her. She looked at him with the face of Mira Ashvin, Factor's assistant, whom he had no reason to know. He looked at her for a moment longer than the situation required. She said, "Good morning, I was just leaving." She walked toward the door. "Miss Valmere," he said quietly from behind her. She stopped. Her back was to him. The door was 6 feet ahead. The senior clerk at the front desk was looking between them with the expression of a person who has just realized he is in a scene he did not sign up for. She stood very still for a long moment. The choice she was standing inside was not complicated in its structure, only in its cost. She could keep walking. She could turn around. Both options had consequences that ran in different directions, and she was standing at the point where the paths diverged and the light was not good enough to see where either one led. She turned around. Aldous Farron was looking at her with the expression of a man who does not want to be doing what he is doing. That was important information. Reluctance is leverage when correctly applied. "You filed the challenge," he said, not accusatory, almost exhausted. "I assisted in preparing a challenge document," she said, keeping her voice even. "Filed by a licensed factor." "Your father sent me," Farron said. The sentence landed in the room. She heard the senior clerk push his chair back very slightly and then stop moving. "My father's provincial notary," she said carefully, "is present in a commercial records office in Keldmere the morning after a challenge document was filed. That's an interesting use of his time." Farron looked at his hands. He was holding a document folder that he had not yet opened or offered. His jaw was working slightly, the movement of a man composing himself. "He wants you to come home," Farron said. "He asked me to tell you that." He looked up. "He said," and here he stopped, and something moved across his face. "He said to tell you that the arrangement with Rennick has been reconsidered." Seris looked at him. She looked at him for a very long time. "The arrangement with Rennick has been reconsidered," she repeated. "Yes. Not the coalition," she said. "Not the certification he signed. Not the testimony he certified." Her voice was still level. She was aware of it being level as a conscious effort, the way you are aware of holding something very heavy and needing to not put it down yet. "The arrangement with Rennick has been reconsidered," as if that was ever the problem. Farron looked away. "He knows what you found," he said. "He knows why you filed the challenge." He paused. "He wants to discuss it." "He wants to discuss it," she said. "Seris." "Miss Valmere," she said, and her voice did not crack, and she was proud of that. Even in the moment, she was proud of it, which was the most complicated feeling she had experienced in a night and a half of complicated feelings. "He signed that document, Aldous. He certified false testimony. He aligned his house with a consortium that is building toward war." She looked at him directly. "What exactly does he want to discuss? Which part of that is up for discussion?" Farron opened the document folder. He placed a single sheet on the desk between them. She looked at it without stepping closer. It was a formal withdrawal document. House Valmere's withdrawal from the Borderland Coalition. Dated this morning. Signed by her father. She looked at it for a long time. This was the offer. This was the thing her father was willing to do, through his notary, in a commercial records office in Keldmere before the sun was fully up. Withdraw from the coalition. In exchange for her return, in exchange for the challenge being dropped, in exchange for the situation returning to the shape it had been before she walked out of his dining room, minus the Rennick arrangement, which had been a disposable piece of it anyway. He was cutting his losses, not because he had understood anything, not because he had examined what he had done and found it wanting, because she had become, through accident and competence and the specific choices of the past 2 days, a liability rather than an asset, and he was adjusting accordingly. She stood very still, and she felt something complete its process inside her, something that had been working toward completion since a slap echoed off a marble floor in her mother's dining room. Her father would always be this. That was the truth of it, clean and without dramatic weight, simply accurate. Her father would always be a man who moved toward whatever held the room's momentum. He had moved toward the consortium when they had momentum. He was moving now because she had created counter-momentum. If she returned, if the challenge was dropped, if the arrangement was reestablished, he would move again the next time momentum shifted, and the next time would cost someone something real, and she would not be able to stop it from inside a household that ran on her invisibility. "No," she said. Farron looked up. "No," she said again. "Tell him no." "Seris?" "Tell him that the challenge stands," she said. "Tell him that if he genuinely wants to withdraw from the coalition, he should withdraw from it because it is the right thing to do and not as a transaction. Tell him." She looked at her father's signature on the withdrawal document, at the seal she had grown up seeing pressed into every piece of paper that meant something in Valmere Hall. "Tell him I hope he chooses correctly. Tell him I will not be coming back to make the choice easier." She picked up her case. "And Aldous," she said, because she had known this man since she was 10 years old, and he had once, when she was 12, explained to her how the filing system worked because she had asked, and he had been the kind of man who answered when children asked earnest questions. "Get out of his employ before this goes further." You're better than what your seal is being used for. She walked out. The street hit her with cold air and gray morning light and the immediate awareness of the men positioned around the trade house 2 blocks east, and she turned north without breaking stride, walking toward the river path, toward Lyra's back gate, toward the tanner's yard, toward Draven, toward whatever was north of here. Her hands were shaking. She walked anyway. And here is the thing that the moment required her to become, the threshold she had just crossed without entirely understanding the geography of the other side. She had refused her father's offer. She had refused the return. She had refused the version of this that resolved neatly into a before and after where she went back and the coalition dissolved and everything was over and she could find a safe corner somewhere in the borderland and be useful in the way she had always been useful, safely invisible. She had refused all of that, which meant there was no version of the next days and weeks that did not require her to be someone who could not be invisible. The consortium would not drop the coalition because one house withdrew. The war would still be building at the northern borders. The documents she carried in her case were evidence, not resolution. Evidence required someone to stand behind it, someone with a face and a name and the willingness to stand in front of whatever court or council or assembly was required and say, "Here is what happened, and here is what I know, and I am willing to be known for knowing it." That person could not be the forgotten daughter of a minor house who had spent 23 years making herself the right size to fit inside someone else's cruelty. She reached the back gate of Lyra's trade house and pushed it open. Draven was there. He looked at her face. "The notary found you, he said. It was not a question. "My father sent him," she said. "He offered to withdraw from the coalition in exchange for my return." A silence. "You said no," Draven said. "I said no," she confirmed. He looked at her with those amber eyes in the early morning light, and something passed between them that was not a conversation and was not a silence, but was something with the quality of recognition. 2 people standing on the same side of a line they have just conclusively crossed, looking at the terrain ahead. "The eastern route I found," she said. "The obscure one. 2 registered users, both fur operations. It runs through the High Harrow, but it comes out north of the Cairn Pass blockade." "How long?" 4 days if the weather holds, possibly 5. He nodded once. "Then we need to move now," he said, "because in approximately He looked at the eastern sky, calculating 40 minutes. The men on the street are going to stop waiting and start moving, and I would rather not be in Keldmere when they do." "Then we go," she said. And she said it the way she said it, not as a question, not as a request, not as someone asking permission to be part of something larger than herself, but as a statement of fact about what was going to happen next, issued by a woman who had just, in a records office on a gray morning in a town that existed for practical reasons, become entirely impossible to contain. They went. They moved out of Keldmere through the tanner's yard with 20 minutes to spare. Lyra had arranged it quietly, efficiently, with the manner of a woman who had made her decision and was not going to revisit it. She gave them a packed supply bundle, a route sketch for the first 8 miles of the river path, and the name of a fur trader at the High Harrow way station who would not ask questions if presented with the right coin. She did not come to the gate when they left. Seris understood that. Some forms of courage require the other person to already be gone before they can be fully inhabited. The river path was frozen hard and ran north through stands of birch that had shed their leaves and stood in white rows like things waiting to be counted. The sky was low and pale, the particular colorless winter sky that withholds information about what it intends to do. Their breath came in white bursts. Neither of them spoke for the first hour, which was not unfriendly but was necessary. The physical work of moving fast over frozen ground in cold air does not easily accommodate conversation. And there was also the processing that both of them were doing in the way that people process large things, which is quietly and in parallel with movement rather than through formal address. Draven's side wound had tightened overnight. She could see the compensation again, the managed rotation, the extra beat before a longer stride. She did not comment on it yet. There was a time for that, and the time was not in the first hour of a necessary escape. The men from the street did not follow them, or if they did not follow quickly enough to matter. By the time the birch stands gave way to the rougher terrain of the high river valley, Keldmere was 2 hours behind them, and the sky ahead had resolved into something more specific. The mountains, their peaks still cloud-covered but their lower shoulders visible, white and hard, and indifferent in the way that large things are indifferent. Not cruelty, but simply scale. She thought about Sable as she walked. Here is the thing about betrayal that distinguishes it from other forms of harm. Ordinary harm comes from outside the boundary of trust, and however terrible it does not revise the past. Betrayal comes from inside that boundary, which means every prior interaction must be reviewed, every piece of information exchanged, every moment of apparent solidarity turned over and examined for its other face. The process is involuntary. It runs whether you want it to or not. A background calculation your mind performs without permission, going back through the record looking for the signs you missed. Draven was running that process. She could see it in the stillness that had settled over him since Greyvile, a stillness different from his usual controlled reserve. This one had an inward quality, the particular focused quiet of a man auditing his own history. 9 years of a contact who had provided safe housing, route intelligence, network coordination for Dominion operations in the southern borderland. 9 years of apparently reliable service, and somewhere inside those 9 years, a pivot point where reliability had been replaced with its performance. The worst part, and she understood this without his having said it, was the impossibility of knowing exactly when. Whether it had been recent, months, or years recent, a gradual acquisition by the consortium through pressure and payment and incremental compromise, or whether it had been much longer, whether the reliability itself had been constructed, a patient infiltration that had fed true information until it was trusted well enough to make false information valuable. Either possibility was terrible in its own way. The second was worse. She put it away for now because she could not solve it while walking, and it needed to be solved by someone with access to Dominion internal records, not by her on a frozen river path. She put it in the same internal cabinet where she had put her father's seal on the certification document and Kael's expression at the dinner table. Things that required a later accounting that she would give when the immediate situation permitted it. At the 4th hour, Draven stopped at a bend in the river path where a flat rock shelf provided clear sight lines in 3 directions and said, without preamble, "Tell me about the route." She opened her case and pulled out the copied documents and laid the relevant sheet on the rock between them, holding the edges against the wind. The Eastern Harrow route runs from this valley, she indicated, northeast through the secondary ridge system rather than through the main cairn corridor. It was certified for commercial use 8 years ago by a fur trading consortium. Not the Halvern Consortium, a different operation. The passage is narrow in 2 sections, here and here, both certified as viable for pack transport in winter but not wagon transport. How narrow? Single file with loaded pack animals. She looked at him. We don't have pack animals. No. Which means those sections we can move through faster than the original certification conditions anticipated. She traced the route further. The way station at the top of the first ridge section is where Lyra's contact operates. After that, we're on Dominion territory inside 40 miles. Draven studied the sheet. He was very close beside her, both of them bent over the document against the wind, and she was aware of his warmth in the cold air and the particular focus he brought to anything tactical, the way his attention gathered and became dense and specific over a map or a problem. The way station, he said. Who else knows it? Every fur trader using the Eastern Harrow, which is currently 2 registered operations, both small. The station won't be on the consortium's target list because it has no strategic significance for anyone who doesn't know about the route. Sable knows the route. She had already thought of this. Sable's records would include Dominion military routes and established diplomatic corridors. The Eastern Harrow is a commercial fur trade route. It's not Dominion flagged anywhere in the administrative record I could access. If he has it, he found it through a different channel than the Dominion network. Draven looked at the route for a moment longer. It's the best we have, he said. It's the best we have, she agreed. They moved on. The way station appeared on the 2nd day in the afternoon, at the top of a ridge that had taken 4 hours to climb and had done things to Seris's knee that she was storing in the same internal cabinet as everything else requiring later attention. It was a single stone building with a turf roof and a stable attached, and smoke coming from the chimney in a manner that suggested recent fire maintenance rather than abandoned cold. The fur trader was a man named Hosk, who was short, weathered to the texture of old saddle leather, and who looked at them with the particular assessment of someone who has operated in remote terrain long enough to have strong opinions about what kind of trouble is worth engaging with. He looked at their coin, looked at Draven. The amber eyes were impossible to resolve as anything other than what they were. Once you had spent 5 minutes in proximity, and made a decision that appeared to rest on some internal calculus Seris could not entirely read. "You're Kaelor," he said, not asking. Draven said nothing. "My father traded the eastern pass routes before the Dominion formalized the northern territory," Hosk said. "Used to say the Lycan clans were the only reason the mountain corridors stayed safe." He looked at Draven for another moment. "That your wound, or someone else's work?" "Someone else's work," Draven said. Hosk nodded. "Come in then. I'll see to it properly, and you can tell me what you need." The way station was warm and smelled of cured fur and wood smoke and the particular animal density of a working trade outpost. Hosk cleared a table without ceremony and examined the wound with the direct efficiency of a man who has dealt with injuries in remote locations and has no patience for either stoicism or drama. "Deeper than it looks," Hosk said. "You've been managing it well, but it's going to pull if you push hard in the next section." "How long is the next section?" Draven asked. 8 miles. First 3 are flat, last 5 climb." Hosk applied something that smelled medicinal and made Draven's jaw tighten. "In your condition, a day and a half. In good condition, a day." "We have a day," Draven said. Hosk looked at him. "Then you'll do it in a day, and it'll cost you something on the far side." "That's acceptable." Hosk looked at Seris. She shrugged, which was not indifference, but was the acknowledgement that Draven was correct about the timeline, and they both knew it. They slept in the way station that night in the hay of the stable, which was warmer than the main room, and which Hosk indicated without commentary was the practical choice. The horses were quiet. The wind moved against the stone walls in the specific searching way of mountain wind, looking for the gap, always looking for the gap. She was almost asleep when Draven said, in the dark, quietly, "He was useful for 9 years." She understood immediately what he meant. She lay still and listened. "He ran a tight operation," Draven said. "Careful. Nothing that flagged as inconsistent. There were 3 situations where his intelligence was the difference between a Dominion operation succeeding and failing, and in at least one of them, the people whose lives depended on it were people he knew." He paused. "I've been trying to work out when it changed." "It may not have changed," she said carefully. "It may have been constructed from the beginning and operated at a loss until he was trusted enough to be useful." Draven was quiet. "That's worse," he said. "I know," she said. "But if it's true, the intelligence he provided was curated, true enough to establish credibility, selected to avoid providing anything that would create a decisive advantage." She thought about it. "The 3 situations where his intelligence was critical, what were the outcomes?" A pause. "We succeeded. All 3. Did any of them result in a permanent shift in Dominion strength, something that changed the strategic balance in a way that would be difficult to reverse?" Longer pause. "No," he said slowly. "They were tactical. Specific operations. None of them resulted in..." He stopped. "None of them resulted in anything the consortium couldn't recover from." "Curated," she said. The wind moved against the walls. 9 years, he said again. The weight in it was not self-pity. It was the specific weight of a leader accounting for the consequences of a misplaced trust. Not in himself alone, but in the people whose security rested on the accuracy of his judgment. That weight is different from personal grief. It is heavier because it has a constituency. "You couldn't have known," she said. "That's not the point," he said. "I know it's not." She looked at the dark above them. "The point is that someone invested 9 years in building a single vector of intelligence access into your operation, which means they consider you a threat large enough to warrant 9 years of investment." She paused. "That's not a comfortable thought, but it's also information about your actual strategic position." Another silence. "You do that," he said. "Do what?" "Find the angle where the bad thing is also information," he said, "rather than just the bad thing." She thought about this. "I learned it from ledgers," she said. "A deficit isn't just a loss. It's information about where the system is leaking. Fix the leak, and the deficit becomes history. In the dark, she heard something that was almost a sound from him, not quite a laugh, not quite anything she could categorize, but something that was adjacent to warmth. "Go to sleep," he said. "I was trying to," she said. She slept. They moved at dawn, and the wound did what Hosk had predicted it would do in the first climb section. She could see it in the set of his face, in the particular economy of movement that indicated managed pain rather than absence of it. And Draven did what he apparently always did with things that cost him, which was to treat the cost as a logistics problem and continue moving. She had stopped commenting on it. He knew she knew. Commenting served no purpose except to make them both more aware of something they were both already aware of. The route climbed northeast through terrain that was beautiful in the way of things that do not care whether they are beautiful, all white stone and black pine, and the occasional frozen waterfall suspended mid-drop like a thing caught in the middle of a thought. The cold was serious up here. Not the borderland cold she'd grown up with. Not even the forest cold of the first night. This was mountain cold, the kind that gets inside your joints and reminds you that your body has opinions about altitude and temperature. She kept moving. The mountains ahead of them had names she didn't know and probably didn't need to know. What they had instead was the quality of barriers becoming passable. The gradual resolution of what had been the abstract concept of going north into the specific physical experience of a pass becoming a valley, becoming lower terrain. They came through the high section at mid-afternoon of the second day, and the Dominion side of the Harrow opened below them. She stopped. She had seen the mountains from below. She had seen them as vast and indifferent and enormous. She had not seen what was on the other side of them. The valley below was wide and dark with pine and threaded with rivers. She couldn't see, but could infer from the way the tree cover organized itself. At the valley's far edge, where the terrain rose again toward a second ridge, there were lights. Even in daylight she could see them. Not many, scattered, the lights of a settlement or an outpost. And further north, just visible through the winter haze, something that was not natural terrain. The geometric lines of constructed things. Walls. She could not see them clearly, but she could feel their presence, the way you feel something that has been built with intention, with purpose, with the sustained effort of people who meant it to last. Draven stood beside her. "Nightfang," he said. She looked at it for a long moment. Then the signal horn sounded from the tree line below them. Not hunting horns. One note, low and carrying, repeated twice. The specific pattern of a sentry alert. Draven went very still. From the tree line below, 4 riders emerged into the open highland and pulled up. They were dressed in the dark functional clothing of Dominion outriders, and 2 of them she could see even at distance were lichen-born. The particular build, the amber quality of their eyes visible even 50 yards out. They were looking up the slope at Draven with expressions she couldn't entirely read at this distance, but which contained something urgent. "Kaelor," the lead rider called up the slope, and his voice carried relief and something beneath relief that was closer to controlled alarm. "We've been riding the eastern corridor for 2 days. Draven descended toward them and she followed, and when they reached the riders, she could see the urgency more clearly. It was in the tightness of their postures, the horses breathing hard from extended travel, the specific quality of attention that people display when they are carrying news they have been carrying too long and are glad to finally deliver. "What happened?" Draven said. The lead rider, she would learn his name was Torin, the Dominion senior border captain, looked at Draven and then, briefly, at her, and then back at Draven with the practiced neutrality of a man who has assessed an unknown variable and decided to proceed as though she is cleared. "The consortium moved 3 days ago," Torin said. "They formally presented the grievance to the Borderland Council. The false testimony, the allied governors, all of it filed as a formal territorial claim challenge." He paused. "The Borderland Council has convened an extraordinary session. They've given the Dominion 7 days to present a counterargument, or the claim stands as preliminary ruling." Draven's expression did not change in any visible way, but she saw the thing behind his eyes process this with complete speed. 7 days from when?" he said. "From 3 days ago," Torin said. 4 days. 4 days to present a counter-argument before a Borderland Council, an extraordinary session that would be heavily weighted by the consortium's allied governors. 4 days. She looked at the documents in her case. "I have the counter-argument," she said. Both men looked at her. "The false testimony," she said to Torin directly. I have the registry documents showing the merchants' consortium affiliation transfers dated within weeks of their testimony. I have the certification document signed by Lord Cassian Valmere and notarized by his household notary. She held Torin's gaze. I have the administrative paper trail that demonstrates the testimony was constructed, and I have enough knowledge of the Borderland administrative system to present it in a way the Council cannot simply dismiss. Torin looked at Draven. She's right, Draven said. It was not qualified. It was not reluctant. It was the flat factual statement of a man who has been watching someone work for 4 days and has updated his assessment accordingly. The council session is in Varenhold, Torin said. 2 days' ride south-southwest. He paused. Through territory the consortium's forces have been moving through for the past week. She ran the geometry in her head. South-southwest was back toward the borderland, back toward the territory they had just moved through, back toward the consortium's network. The Dominion border was behind them now, and the council session was ahead, which meant crossing back through contested terrain with a 4-day deadline and whatever the consortium had deployed in the interim. She looked at Draven. He was looking at the mountains behind them with the expression of a man measuring a cost he has already decided to pay. How many riders can you provide? He asked Torin. 8. We have a second unit at the Valley Way Station. Another day's ride. We go with what's here, Draven said. Time matters more than numbers. Torin looked at the wound visible now through Draven's coat where the climb had opened it slightly. He looked at Draven's face with the expression of a long-serving captain who has opinions he is calculating whether to voice. Say it, Draven said. You're not fit for hard riding, Torin said. I'm aware. If we make contact with consortium forces, I'm aware, Draven said again, with a precision that was not dismissal but was the end of the conversation. Torin looked at him for another moment and then nodded once, the nod of a man who has made his objection and accepted the answer. They rode south. The first contact came 18 miles in, at a narrow valley crossing where the track went between 2 outcroppings of stone and was, therefore, a natural choke point, the kind of geography that anyone planning an ambush would use without hesitation. Seris saw it at the same time Draven did, though she would not know until later whether what she recognized was tactical geometry or simply the same instinct for reading environments that she'd been developing in household corridors and dining rooms for 20 years. The outriders in the rocks above them were not well hidden. They were adequate. Adequate is enough when you have numbers and a choke point. Draven pulled up 40 yards out. The valley crossing was quiet. The horses moved with the particular attention of animals that smell something humans haven't processed yet. How many? She said very quietly. 12, maybe 14. He was looking at the rock faces without turning his head directly toward them. 2 positions, east and west outcropping. Crossbows, probably. Maybe 1 or 2 rifles. They're waiting for us to enter the crossing, Torin said, equally quiet. Yes, Draven said. She looked at the valley, at the rock faces, at the angles. She had never studied military strategy in any formal way, but she had studied spatial problems her entire life. The household that runs on limited resources requires you to understand where the constraints are and how they interact, which is the same underlying problem as a tactical choke point in a different domain. The east outcropping is higher, she said. If your riders split, half going wide around the east side and half drawing attention at the crossing entrance. The west position won't be able to get clean angles on the riders going east, Draven finished. He looked at her sidelong, quick. The east riders would need to climb, but the approach is covered by the outcropping's own shadow until they're at elevation, she said. 20 minutes, maybe less. 12 to 14 trained shooters, Torin said, against 8 riders. Against 6 riders making noise at the crossing entrance, Draven said, and 2 riders coming over the east face from an angle they're not covering. He looked at Torin. Who are your 2 best climbers? The answer to that question was resolved with the economy of men who have worked together in difficult terrain, and then 4 things happened in quick succession. 2 of Torin's riders separated and moved east with the specific unhurried pace of people who are trying to look like they are retreating rather than flanking. The remaining 6 fanned across the entrance to the valley crossing and created the visual impression of a group debating whether to proceed. And Seris found herself next to Draven at the front of the group with the distinct awareness that if the people in those rocks had been properly briefed on who was riding with the Dominion outriders, she and Draven were the primary targets. "If they fire," she said quietly to Draven, "the horses bolt." "Yes. So if they fire, I need to stay on." "Yes," he said. "Can you?" She thought about the ladder fall 2 years ago and her niece's subsequent opinions. She thought about the fact that she had been riding since she was 7 years old and that competent riding, like competent administrative work, was something her mother had considered a useful skill and had therefore ensured she developed it. "Yes," she said. They waited. Here is the truth about waiting in a situation where violence is probable. It does not feel like the stories say it feels. It does not feel like suspended time or crystalline clarity. It feels like being very aware of your own body's involuntary processes. The heart doing something complicated in your chest. The hands that want to do something with themselves. The specific quality of attention that is narrowed to the point where peripheral vision stops being reliable information and becomes noise. It feels like being very aware that you are made of soft things. She was aware of all of this. She was also watching the east face of the outcropping. The signal came from Torin's lead rider, a short whistle that meant the climbers were at elevation. And then everything stopped being slow. The consortium shooters in the rocks had a problem that their positioning had not accounted for. 2 of their number were occupied suddenly by threats from above, which meant the coordinated volley they had planned was compromised before it could be executed, which meant the moment of decision about whether to fire was confused, and in military situations, confused moments of decision are often fatal. 2 bolts came out of the west outcropping, fast and wide. One of Torin's riders took a graze across the shoulder that he would deal with later. The horses surged. They went through the crossing at a hard run, and Seris rode the way she had learned to ride, low, centered, letting the horses' movement happen under her rather than fighting it. And the rocks went by on both sides with the blurred urgency of things you are moving past faster than you can process them. And then they were through and the valley opened up on the other side, and behind them she could hear the sounds of the east face situation resolving itself in the way Draven had anticipated. She pulled up with the others and turned to count. 7 riders. 1 wound, minor. Draven on a dark horse to her right, with blood showing at his side again. The crossing had opened it more, and his face set in the expression she had learned to recognize as pain being managed at a level that required significant effort. "How bad?" she said to him directly. No preamble. "Manageable," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "It's manageable for 2 more days," he said. "After that it becomes a different conversation." 2 more days. 2 days to Varenhold. She did not let herself calculate what 2 more days of hard riding with an open wound in mountain terrain meant for the different conversation that followed it. She put that in the cabinet with everything else. "Then we ride," she said. They rode. The second contact did not come as an ambush. It came as a message, which was worse. At the southern edge of the contested corridor, at a way station that Torin vouched for as clean, a rider was waiting with a sealed letter bearing the Borderland Council's administrative stamp. He handed it to Torin without words and left immediately, which was its own kind of statement. Torin broke the seal. He read it. He looked at Draven with an expression that was controlled in the way that Torin controlled things. Efficiently, without excess, but that contained within that control something she had not seen in his face before. "They moved the session," Torin said. Draven looked at him. "The consortium filed an emergency urgency petition," Torin said. 3 of the allied governors co-signed. The council agreed to convene in full session in... He looked at the letter, 2 days from this letter's date. He looked up, which was written yesterday. "Tomorrow," Draven said. "Tomorrow evening," Torin said, "in Varenhold. 1 day. 1 day to cover ground that their remaining option suggested was a day and a half at minimum. In a convoy that now included a rider with a shoulder wound and Draven with a side wound that was 2 days from a different conversation, heading into a council session that had been deliberately accelerated to create exactly this kind of impossible deadline. She took the letter from Torin's hands and read it herself, because she had learned a long time ago not to rely on summaries of important documents. The language of the urgency petition was interesting. She read it twice. The petition cited not just the territorial claim, but a secondary instrument, a provision of Borderland Council procedural law that she recognized from 3 years of managing correspondence that occasionally touched administrative governance. The provision allowed for a ruling in absentia when the challenged party had been formally notified and had failed to present defense within the prescribed period. They were trying to get a ruling tonight. "They don't need the 7 days to expire," she said. Both men looked at her. "The urgency petition," she said, cites procedural provision 12, which allows for in absentia ruling if the challenged party has been notified and hasn't responded. The Dominion received formal notification. She looked at Torin. 4 days ago, Torin said, which means the 7-day period has already been running. The consortium's move was to compress the session and call for immediate ruling on the grounds that the Dominion hasn't responded. She looked at the letter. If we don't appear before the council by tomorrow evening, they don't need to wait out the remaining days. They take the ruling tonight or tomorrow morning, and it stands. Draven looked at the terrain ahead of them, at the sky, which was doing something with the light that suggested weather coming in from the northwest. "We ride through the night," he said. "Your wound, we ride through the night," he said again. It was not the tone of a man dismissing concern. It was the tone of a man who has completed the cost-benefit analysis and reached a conclusion that the cost is worth it, and who is now operating from the conclusion rather than from the analysis. There is something to understand about leadership, real leadership, not the performed variety, not the kind that announces itself and requires audience validation, that most discussions of power miss entirely. Real leadership is a form of debt. Every person whose safety, livelihood, or future depends on a leader's decisions is a creditor, and the leader carries that debt continuously. And the decisions that leadership requires are not made from a position of freedom, but from a position of obligation. Draven Kaelor had ruled Nightfang Dominion for 9 years, and the Dominion was not an abstraction. It was warriors and traders and families in stone citadels, and children who grew up under banners stitched with lunar sigils, and who had never once been asked to worry about whether their king was going to make the right call. That was the bargain. That was always the bargain. He was going to ride through the night with an open wound because 14 people inside 40 miles of Varenhold were counting on the assumption that he would. She understood this. She also understood that she was going to ride with him. They rode through the night. The weather came in at the second hour. Not a storm, but the hard, persistent cold of a high-altitude front moving through, driving wind from the northwest that got inside every gap in their clothing and found all the places that a long day of hard riding had already made vulnerable. The path was dark, and the horses navigated it with the careful intelligence of animals that take night terrain seriously. And the riders held close and moved fast, and the hours accumulated in the specific way. Hours accumulate when you are beyond tired and operating on the part of your reserves that exists below tiredness, the part that is pure forward movement without the luxury of commentary. Seris did not think about the council session. She did not think about what she was going to say or how she was going to say it. She had learned long ago that some preparations are best made before the event, and some can only be made inside it, and the preparation she needed now was not strategic. It was physical, the simple maintenance of staying on the horse, and staying warm and staying forward, and everything else could wait. At the 4th hour, Draven pulled up briefly, and she pulled up beside him, and he looked at her with those amber eyes in the dark and said nothing. And she said nothing, and they looked at each other for a moment in the cold mountain dark, and the thing that passed between them had no language but was completely legible. She was here. She was staying. He knew. They rode. Dawn came gray and exhausted looking, and with it, the outskirts of the territory that Torin said was within an hour of Varenhold. The terrain had changed over the long night from mountain to highland to the rolling cultivated land of the borderland interior, and the change was visible in the light, even in winter. The organized geometry of farmed landscape replacing the wild logic of mountain terrain, roads becoming more regular, settlements appearing at sensible intervals. They stopped at the edge of a pine copse half a mile from Varenhold's northern gate, and Draven dismounted and Seris dismounted, and Torin's riders held back with the professional tact of people who understand that what is about to happen is not for them. Draven looked at her. He was pale from the night's work and from what the wound had been doing through it, and there were shadows under his amber eyes that had not been there when she first saw his face in a clearing 4 nights ago. And he was upright and present and meeting her gaze with the full quality of attention she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he actually valued. What you have in that case, he said, is the foundation of a counterargument that I cannot make as well as you can. He said it directly, not as compliment, but as tactical assessment. The council will know who I am. They will hear my argument through the filter of everything they believe or have been told about the Dominion. I'm a runaway noble daughter with a borrowed name and my father's provincial seal on a document I copied without authorization, she said. You're the person who knows where the bodies are buried in the administrative record, he said, and who can stand in front of a borderland council and explain it in their own language. He paused. That is not a small thing. She looked at Varenhold's walls, visible over the tree line. If I walk into that council session, she said carefully, I am no longer Mira Ashvin. No, he said. I am Seris Valmere, eldest daughter of a House Valmere signatory to the coalition I'm challenging. She let that sit for a moment. That is either my most powerful credential or my most significant liability, depending on whether the council reads it as conflict of interest or as insider testimony. Which do you read it as? He said. She thought about her father's seal, about Aldous Farron's face in the records office, about the withdrawal document she had refused, about 23 years of being the person in the room who understood what was happening and was not permitted to say so. Insider testimony, she said. Then that's what it is, he said. She looked at him. She looked at the case in her hand with its copied documents and the root notes and the administrative evidence she had assembled from a provincial records office in a town she had been in for less than a day, armed with skills she had developed involuntarily in the service of a household that had never once asked her to care about what she was actually building. She thought about what she was about to walk into. A borderland council in extraordinary session, weighted with consortium-allied governors, convened specifically to produce a ruling that would legitimize a manufactured war. She had evidence that undermined the testimony the ruling was built on. She had knowledge of the administrative system that had been used to construct that evidence. She had a name that was simultaneously a liability and a credential, and the story of a woman who had walked out of the machinery of her own erasure and built something entirely different with the tools she wasn't supposed to have. She was 23 years old. She looked at Draven, and he looked back at her. And in the gray winter dawn outside Varenhold's walls, with everything that was about to happen on the other side of that northern gate, she felt something settle in her chest with the specific weight of a decision that has been made at a level deeper than conscious choice, not the result of calculation. The result of being, at last, entirely what she was. Let's go, she said, and the gates of Varenhold were ahead of them, and inside those gates the council was already assembling, and the consortium's allied governors were already in their seats, and the ruling they had engineered across months of false testimony and manufactured coalition was 40 minutes from being called to order. She walked through the gates with her case in her hand and her father's name on her lips and the truth in her possession, and behind her the Alpha King of the Nightfang Dominion walked at her side as an equal rather than a protector, and the council chamber doors were ahead, and the moment that nothing and no one could take back was 30 seconds away. The council chamber of Varenhold was built from stone older than the treaties it had witnessed, and it smelled of cold slate and old decisions and the particular institutional density of a room that has absorbed a century of consequential mornings. 7 governors sat at the oak table, 4 consortium aligned, 2 neutral, and Fenwick Caro at the head, 18 years as presiding chair, a man whose entire reputation rested on a single consistent principle. The council's procedural authority mattered more than any individual faction's agenda. That was the margin she was working with. The consortium's lawyer was mid-sentence when the chamber doors opened. He was precise, well-rehearsed, and had clearly expected no serious opposition. He stopped when Draven Kaelor walked in, because rooms always stopped when Draven Kaelor walked in, and then Seris moved to the table before the silence could organize itself into something the lawyer could use. "Governor Caro," she said clearly. "My name is Seris Valmere, eldest daughter of Lord Cassian Valmere of House Valmere, signatory to the coalition presenting grievance before this council. I have documentation demonstrating procedural defects in the evidentiary foundation of that grievance, and I am invoking the right of evidentiary challenge under council procedure." The lawyer found his footing immediately. "House Valmere is a coalition signatory. This woman standing to challenge The right of evidentiary challenge does not require the challenger to represent any party, she said, to Kaelor directly, not the lawyer. She had learned long ago that in a room with a single decision-maker, the audience that matters is not the loudest voice, but the one with the authority. It requires documented evidence and credentialed standing. I have both. She opened her case and laid the documents on the table in the sequence she had determined during the long, cold hours of the night's writing. Not randomly. With the precision of someone who understands that the same information delivered in different orders lands differently, and that the order which is hardest to dismiss begins not with accusation, but with fact. First, the merchant registry transfers. Dry, administrative, bureaucratic. 3 names, 3 transfer dates, 1 receiving party, the Halvern Consortium, Land and Trade Division. Then the testimony documents, their dates sitting uncomfortably close to the transfer dates. Then last, placed with the deliberateness of a final argument, the certification bearing her father's provincial seal. The registry transfers established that the 3 merchants whose testimony forms the evidentiary foundation of this grievance were commercially affiliated with the Halvern Consortium at the time they provided that testimony, she said. 2 of the 3 completed their affiliation transfers within months of testifying. The certification of that testimony bears the provincial seal of Lord Seris Valmere, a coalition signatory, and the notarial mark of his household notary. She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. The grievance is built on testimony provided by consortium-affiliated witnesses, certified by a coalition signatory, in a proceeding that would directly benefit both parties. This council's procedural standards require testimony to be free of material interest conflicts. These documents demonstrate undisclosed material interest conflicts. The certification is procedurally defective. The chamber was very quiet. Governor Drast, one of the consortium-aligned 4, said, "Commercial affiliation does not automatically disqualify. Undisclosed commercial affiliation established within weeks of providing testimony in a proceeding that would generate direct financial benefit to the affiliated party absolutely requires independent corroboration," she said. That corroboration does not exist in the filing. What exists is a self-referential evidentiary structure with no independent foundation. Kaelor had been reading the documents while she spoke, actually reading them, not performing engagement. She had built the sequence for a man like him, and she watched him follow it, watched the logic land the way she had watched it land in the records office, the growing comprehension of what the dates were saying, the specific moment when the pattern became undeniable. He set the last sheet down. "I am suspending the urgency petition," he said. "The evidentiary basis requires administrative review before this council can proceed to ruling. The 7-day period resets from today." The consortium's lawyer started to speak. "The urgency petition was filed against a grievance that has just been shown to have procedural defects in its evidentiary foundation," Kaelor said, without raising his voice and without looking at the lawyer. "Urgency does not override accuracy. That has been the standard of this council for 40 years. He stood. "This session is recessed." She stood at the table after the room began moving and did not feel triumph, which would have been too simple. What she felt was something more like the sensation of a locked mechanism finally releasing. The specific internal shift of a system that has been held under pressure for a long time finding its natural position. She had not ended the consortium. She had not dissolved the coalition. She had created a procedural delay and reset a timeline and forced a review. And the consortium would regroup and find other instruments, and the pressure on Nightfang's borders would not disappear because of one morning. But the war that had been 48 hours from beginning did not begin. And she understood, with a clarity that had nothing performative in it, that the people who would have fought that war, who would have marched into volcanic highland passes under a manufactured grievance dressed as law, those people went home. They went home, and they did not know why. They did not know about a leather case or a records office or a night's hard riding or a woman who had walked out of a marble house with 7 coins and arrived here. That was all right. Results do not require credit to be real. Draven's hand came to rest on her shoulder. Not possessive, present. She put her hand over his. Her father was waiting outside. She had not expected this, which in retrospect was naive. He was a man who moved toward momentum, and the momentum had shifted, and here he was, standing at the edge of the street in the gray morning with his characteristic stillness that she had spent 23 years reading as composure and now read as the practiced absence of committed expression. He looked older than she remembered. 5 days felt like a longer interval than it was. "Seris?" he said. "Father?" she said. "What you did in there?" He said it carefully, the way he said everything, testing the ground before committing weight. "Was necessary," she said. "It exposed the family. It exposed a false testimony that you certified," she said, without heat, which cost her more than heat would have. Heat is release. What she was doing was staying in the accurate temperature of things. "I didn't create the exposure. You made the choices that created it. I presented evidence of what those choices were." He was quiet for a moment. She watched the familiar calculation happen in him. Where is the momentum now? Which way does it point? What is the least costly position? And she watched it complete itself, and then, for what she believed was the first time in his life in her presence, she watched him set it aside. "I knew the testimony was constructed," he said. Quietly enough that only she could hear it, she breathed. "Then you know what the withdrawal needs to mean," she said. "Not a position adjustment, a full withdrawal. The certification formally retracted. Your account of the construction process provided to the council's review." She held his eyes. "That's the accurate accounting." He looked at the street, at his hands, at the ordinary morning going about its business around them. He was 61 years old, and he had spent 61 years being the man who was present when things happened without committing to them. And she was watching the last moment of that pattern, the moment when it either broke or didn't. "I'll speak to Caro," he said. She nodded once. "Seris." His voice changed slightly, not dramatically. "A small shift, the kind that costs something. The house will be different." It was not the sentence he had started, and it was probably the most honest thing he knew how to offer. She understood that. And here's the thing about forgiveness that the easy versions of it miss. It is not the restoration of what was lost. It does not rebuild the years or return the mornings or unpress the seal on a certification document. It does not require the other person to have become deserving. It is the act of putting something down, not for the other person, for yourself. Because some weights cost more to carry than to release, and you are the one paying the cost. She had been carrying her father for 23 years, the specific weight of a parent whose love was conditional in the way of people who have never learned to offer anything that could not be taken back. She put it down. "All right," she said. "Be different." She walked back to Draven. He did not ask what had been said. She did not offer it. What she did was stand beside him in the gray morning and exist for a moment in the space after something large concludes. The breathing room between one state and the next, before the next thing begins. "It will hold," he said. He was not talking about the session. He meant the review, the reset timeline, the structural shift in the council's composition that would follow her father's account. "It will hold," she agreed. They stayed in Varenhold 3 days. Her father met with Caro and provided a written account that was not complete. She did not expect complete. She expected useful. And 2 of the consortium's allied governors began the specific organizational behavior of people distancing themselves from a failing position. Not all 4. 2. 2 is enough to shift the council's balance into something the consortium no longer controlled. On the 3rd evening, she stood at the window of their room and watched the street and heard Draven come to stand behind her. "The Dominion Council will want a full accounting," he said. "Every operation Sable had knowledge of, every contact, every route, every piece of intelligence exchanged over 9 years. It will take months." "I know," she said. "I could use someone who understands how constructed networks are built," he said carefully. "Someone who knows what the documentation looks like and how to read what's missing." She looked at the street below. "Are you asking me to come north?" "I'm telling you I want you to," he said, "and that I know those are different things." She turned from the window. He was looking at her with the amber eyes and something in his face she had not seen before in that precise configuration. Not the controlled tactical attention, not the managed stillness of a man in crisis. Something that required more courage than either of those, because it had no defensive function. It was simply him, visible, having decided that she was the person he was willing to be seen clearly by. There's a thing that power does to people who hold it for a long time without a counterweight. It narrows the world into the dimensions of what can be controlled, and everything outside those dimensions becomes threat rather than resource. Draven had held Nightfang for 9 years, and the narrowing had begun, the way it always begins, quietly and from the inside. What had interrupted it was 5 days of watching a woman with a leather case and 7 coins and 23 years of compressed capability move through every obstacle the world had managed to place in front of her and convert each one into the next foothold. He had not rescued her. She had not rescued him. What had happened instead was the more difficult and more valuable thing. 2 people who had each been carrying their respective weights alone, discovering that some weights are genuinely easier carried together, not because one person carries more, but because the distribution changes what is possible. When we get to Nightfang, she said, I am not an ornament. I am not a symbol. I am someone who does real work, work that uses what I actually have. She held his gaze. If that changes, if I become something kept rather than someone contributing, I need to know we can say it. He looked at her for a long moment. In the Dominion, he said, a queen who cannot govern is a liability. I have enough liabilities. Something moved in his face that was as close to humor as she had seen from him, and beneath it something more serious. I don't need another one. I need what you are. She looked at him. 23 years of a house that had managed her capabilities the way you manage a resource. Carefully, minimally, in service of other people's purposes. 5 days of a world that had asked repeatedly, not for her performance of usefulness, but for her actual intelligence and actual service of things she had chosen to care about. She chose. Then let's go north, she said. They rode out on the 4th morning, heading north through terrain she knew now. The highland and the black pine and the frozen river paths, and eventually the high mountain corridors that were hard going and worth going. She rode without looking back at the borderland behind her, not because she felt nothing about it, because looking back is for things you are uncertain about. The mountains received them without ceremony, which was appropriate. Large things do not require ceremony. They require navigation. And she navigated them beside a man who had learned, across 5 days and several hundred miles of contested ground, that real partnership is not the softening of strength, but the multiplication of it. The 2 people operating at full capacity together achieve what neither can alone, and that a king who understands this is more dangerous to his enemies and more valuable to his people than any number of subordinates who simply obey. There's a particular kind of person who comes into their full capability only when the ordinary infrastructure of safety has been stripped away and they are required to operate on what they actually possess, not what they have been permitted to use, not the narrow bandwidth of a life shaped around someone else's comfort, what they actually have, which has been developing in the dark the whole time, waiting for conditions that would require it. Seris Valmere was one of those people. She had grown up in marble halls and polished cruelty and left with 7 coins, and she had arrived at the other side of the mountains as someone who had moved the machinery of institutional power with a leather case, identified a 9-year infiltration, and chosen the direction of her own life with both hands and full knowledge of what the choosing cost. Not rescued, not claimed, not transferred from one household's ledger to another. Chosen. On her own terms, for her own reasons, with clear eyes and the specific courage of someone who has finally stopped being afraid of the size she actually is. Nightfang Dominion appeared below them in the late afternoon of the 5th day. The stone citadels climbing the mountainsides, the iron bridges spanning silver rivers, the watchfires burning across fortified ridges while warriors moved beneath banners stitched with lunar sigils. Enormous and real and chosen, which made it different from anything she had ever inhabited before. Draven pulled his horse up beside hers at the ridgeline, and they looked down at the valley together. Ready? He said. She thought about the servant who had believed herself disposable. She thought about the ledgers she had kept that no one acknowledged. She thought about the long cold night of riding and the gray morning in the council chamber and the documents on the 100-year-old table and her father's voice saying quietly, in a borderland street, the most honest thing he knew how to offer. She thought about what it meant to be known clearly by the person beside you, and to know them in return, not the comfortable knowing of people who have agreed not to look too hard at each other, but the knowing of people who have seen each other in the worst conditions and the most honest moments and have found each other, on balance and with full information, worth the choosing. She looked at the kingdom below. I've been ready, she said. They rode down together into the valley, and the watchfires burned against the early winter dark, and Nightfang Dominion opened itself to receive its king home. And beside him, something new. Not a guest, not a ward, not a symbol wrapped in midnight silk and placed on a throne for effect. A woman who had made herself from the materials available in a house that was not supposed to produce her, who had walked north from a slap that echoed off marble floors and traveled through bounty hunters and mountain passes and frozen stream bed and council chambers and every version of the world telling her she was the wrong size. She had not adjusted her size. The world had adjusted. The gates of Nightfang rose before them in the torchlight, iron and stone, and the weight of 9 years of defended sovereignty, and the warriors on the walls who had been watching the ridge for days went still and then moved. The particular motion of people who have been waiting for something and have finally seen it. Draven did not slow. Neither did she. They rode through the gates together, and the kingdom received them, and the watchfires burned on through the winter dark. And somewhere in the marble halls of the borderland behind them, the chandeliers continued their indifferent glittering above the exhaustion of whoever had been left to maintain them. She did not think about that. She was already inside the walls, already looking at what was ahead, already thinking about the work, the real work, the work that used what she actually had, the work that would take months and years and would be hard and worth doing. She had left a prison. She had not found a rescue. She had found something better and harder and entirely hers. She had found the throne that had always been waiting inside herself. And she had arrived at it the only way such thrones are ever reached. Not through inheritance, not through transaction, not through anyone's permission. Through the long and difficult and irreversible act of becoming, at last, completely what she was.